Tonight, we're not talking about the loud mobsters, not the men who crave headlines, courtrooms, or movie deals. This story belongs to someone far more dangerous because of his silence. While names like Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese echo through newspapers, one man operated quietly in the background. Never flashy, never reckless, never exposed. Yet when decisions were made, wars avoided, or power transferred, his voice mattered more than almost anyone else's. Michele Big Mike Miranda didn't rule through fear alone. He ruled through trust. In a world built on betrayal, he survived for decades. In a criminal system that devoured its own leaders, he remained untouched. And inside the most powerful crime family in America, he became the man everyone depended on, even the bosses themselves. Tonight, we step into the shadows of the American Mafia's most powerful era to uncover the life of the man who never sought attention, never chased glory, and yet helped shape the Genovese dynasty from behind the curtain. Before we begin, comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy calm, cinematic mob stories like this, subscribe now for more untold histories from the underworld. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1, Origins of a Quiet Power. Michele Miranda was born into a world where silence was not weakness. It was survival. He entered life at the turn of the 20th century, a time when Italian immigrant neighborhoods in New York were tightly knit, insular, and deeply mistrustful of outsiders. These communities carried with them old country values, unwritten rules, and a strong belief that respect was earned not by words, but by conduct. For young Michele, this environment shaped everything. Unlike many future mob figures, Miranda did not grow up seeking attention or dominance. He was observant, patient. He learned early that the men who lasted were not always the ones who spoke the loudest, but the ones who listened carefully. The New York underworld during Miranda's youth was fragmented and volatile. Small gangs competed for territory, influence, and protection rackets. Violence was common, but stability was rare. Power shifted quickly, and loyalty was often temporary. In this chaos, Miranda distinguished himself not through brutality, but reliability. He became known as someone who could be trusted to handle sensitive matters discreetly. When disputes arose, he did not escalate them. He absorbed information, weighed outcomes, and moved carefully. This approach made him invaluable to older, more established figures who understood that survival required balance as much as strength. As the Mafia began transitioning from loose neighborhood gangs into a more organized structure, Miranda found his place naturally. He aligned himself with rising leaders who valued discipline over chaos. His calm presence, combined with unwavering loyalty, allowed him to move steadily upward without attracting attention from law enforcement or rival factions. By the time the American Mafia began formalizing itself into families and hierarchies, Michele Big Mike Miranda was already deeply embedded, not as a showman, but as a stabilizer. Someone others leaned on when emotions ran high and decisions carried consequences. This foundation would define his entire career. In the next segment, we'll explore how Miranda navigated the explosive transformation of the Mafia during its bloodiest era, and how he emerged not only alive, but more powerful than ever. Chapter 1, Segment 2, Surviving the Bloodiest Years of the American Mafia. The period that followed Michele Big Mike Miranda's early rise was one of the most violent and unstable eras in Mafia history. It was a time when leadership changed not through succession, but through gunfire. Bosses were eliminated in restaurants, on street corners, and in parked cars. Alliances shifted overnight, and survival often depended on choosing the right silence at the right moment. Miranda lived through all of it. As the mafia evolved from scattered street gangs into a centralized criminal organization, tensions intensified. The old Sicilian traditions clashed with a new American reality. Younger gangsters pushed for profit and speed, while older leaders demanded discipline and secrecy. This conflict reached its breaking point during the Castellammarese War, a brutal internal struggle that reshaped organized crime in New York. Many men did not survive this transition. Michele Miranda did, because he understood something others ignored. Power during this era did not belong to the loudest killers or the most aggressive bosses. It belonged to the men who could move between factions without being seen as a threat. Men who could be trusted to carry messages, negotiate peace, and enforce decisions quietly. Miranda became one of those men. While others chased reputation through violence, he cultivated relationships. He was present at key moments, but rarely at the center of attention. When meetings were held, he listened more than he spoke. When decisions were made, he supported them without ego. This earned him something far more valuable than fear, credibility. As Lucky Luciano dismantled the old mafia structure and replaced it with a modern commission system, Miranda adapted seamlessly. He did not resist change. He did not challenge leadership. Instead, he became a stabilizing force during the transformation, ensuring continuity while others fell. This adaptability protected him. Law enforcement attention during this time focused on the most visible figures. The men who made headlines, who flaunted wealth, who left trails of violence. Miranda avoided all of it. His lifestyle remained modest. His name rarely appeared in police files. To outsiders, he seemed almost invisible. But inside the organization, his influence grew. He became a trusted intermediary, someone leadership relied on to manage sensitive internal matters. Disputes between crews, concerns about loyalty, and questions of succession often passed through him. His role was not to dominate, but to maintain equilibrium. This was especially crucial as Vito Genovese began consolidating power. Genovese was ambitious, ruthless, and strategic. He valued efficiency and control, and he understood the importance of surrounding himself with men who could be relied upon completely. Miranda fit this role perfectly. He was dependable, discreet, and aligned with Genovese's vision of a disciplined, tightly controlled crime family. As other figures were imprisoned, murdered, or sidelined, Miranda remained steady. He did not challenge Genovese. He did not compete with flashier underbosses or capos. Instead, he became indispensable, the kind of man whose absence would create instability. This is how Miranda survived the mafia's most dangerous years. Not by being untouchable, but by being necessary. By the end of this violent era, many of the men who once towered over the underworld were gone. Their names entered legend, but their lives ended early. Miranda, meanwhile, stood quietly among the survivors, older, wiser, and more powerful than ever. In the next segment, we'll examine how Michele, Big Mike, Miranda transitioned from survivor to architect, helping shape the Genovese crime family into the most stable and feared organization in American Mafia history. Chapter 1, Segment 3, Becoming Indispensable Without Ever Taking the Throne. By the time the bloodiest years of Mafia conflict began to settle, Michele, Big Mike, Miranda had achieved something rare in organized crime. He was still alive. More than that, he was still trusted. In a world where loyalty was temporary and power was constantly contested, Miranda had quietly positioned himself as a constant. He was not a boss in title, but he was a presence that leadership relied upon. This distinction mattered more than rank. Titles attracted attention. Dependability created longevity. The mafia structure stabilized under the commission system. The Genovese crime family emerged as the most disciplined and strategically cautious organization in New York. This was not accidental. It was the result of careful internal management, controlled violence, and a strict adherence to hierarchy. Miranda played a central role in maintaining that internal balance. He became a man whose approval mattered. When disputes arose between capos, Miranda was often consulted. When concerns about loyalty surfaced, he was trusted to assess them. When leadership needed reassurance that decisions would be carried out without friction, he was the one expected to ensure happened. His power was not public, but it was deeply embedded. This role required a specific kind of personality. Miranda was not impulsive. He did not indulge in personal vendettas. He rarely acted out of anger. Instead, he viewed the organization as a system that needed to function smoothly. Emotional decisions created instability. Instability invited attention. Attention invited law enforcement. Miranda understood that survival depended on invisibility. While other figures accumulated wealth and status, Miranda kept his profile deliberately low. He avoided ostentatious displays. He did not surround himself with unnecessary associates. His movements were predictable, his routines disciplined. This made him nearly impossible to target, legally or criminally. At the same time, his reputation within the underworld continued to grow. He was seen as fair, not merciful, but fair. Decisions he supported were understood to be calculated, not personal. This earned him respect across different factions, including those outside the Genovese family. Other families recognized Miranda as someone whose word carried weight. This is where his true power emerged. Miranda became a bridge between generations. He understood the old Sicilian traditions, but he also embraced the modern American Mafia's emphasis on profit, coordination, and restraint. This made him uniquely suited to guide transitions without conflict. When leadership changed, Miranda ensured continuity. When tensions rose, Miranda diffused them. When ambitious figures tested boundaries, Miranda quietly reinforced them. He did all of this without ever positioning himself as the face of authority. This was intentional. Miranda understood that bosses were targets. Underbosses were targets. Even high-profile capos attracted scrutiny. But men who operated quietly, who facilitated rather than commanded, often lasted the longest. They became institutional memory, repositories of knowledge that could not easily be replaced. Inside the Genovese family, Miranda was exactly that he knew who owed favors. He knew which alliances were genuine and which were temporary. He knew which conflicts could be ignored and which required immediate intervention. This knowledge made him invaluable. As years passed, younger members saw Miranda as a symbol of stability. Older members saw him as a safeguard against chaos. Leadership saw him as someone whose loyalty did not need to be questioned. And law enforcement barely saw him at all. This combination, trust from within, invisibility from without, allowed Miranda to operate at the highest levels of organized crime without ever appearing to do so. He was present at pivotal moments, yet absent from public narratives. His influence shaped outcomes, even when his name was never mentioned. By the end of this period, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda was no longer simply a survivor of mafia violence. He was a cornerstone. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into Miranda's role within the Genovese crime family, examining how he helped maintain its reputation as the most powerful, disciplined, and enduring organization in American Mafia history. Chapter 2, Segment 1, Inside the Genovese Family, the Architecture of Silent Power. By the time Michele "Big Mike" Miranda reached the height of his influence, the Genovese crime family had become something fundamentally different from the other mafia organizations operating in New York. Where other families relied on spectacle, intimidation, and visible leadership, the Genovese family functioned like a hidden machine, efficient, disciplined, and deliberately invisible. Miranda was one of the key architects of that design. The Genovese family's power did not come from chaos. It came from control. Unlike rival families that suffered from internal rebellions, public indictments, and power struggles, the Genovese organization avoided instability through a culture of restraint. Violence was used sparingly. Orders were communicated indirectly. Decisions were made quietly and enforced without explanation. This environment suited Miranda perfectly. He did not command crews on the street. He did not seek media attention. He did not cultivate fear for its own sake. Instead, he operated as part of the family's internal nervous system, transmitting information, maintaining balance, and ensuring that leadership decisions were respected without challenge. This role placed him in constant proximity to power without exposing him to its dangers. At this stage in his career, Miranda had earned something rare: universal trust. Bosses trusted him because he never undermined authority. Capos trusted him because he was fair and predictable. Soldiers respected him because he did not abuse his influence. Trust was the Genovese family's most valuable currency, and Miranda handled it carefully. One of his primary responsibilities was internal coordination. When disputes arose between crews over territory, earnings, or perceived disrespect, Miranda often served as a quiet mediator. His involvement signaled that leadership was paying attention, but it also offered a path toward resolution without bloodshed. This approach preserved profits and reduced risk. Miranda understood that every act of violence created consequences beyond the immediate target. It invited retaliation, law enforcement scrutiny, and instability. By preventing unnecessary conflict, he protected the family's long-term interests. This made him indispensable to leadership figures who prioritized longevity over ego. His relationship with Vito Genovese exemplified this dynamic. Genovese was known for his ambition and ruthlessness, but he was also pragmatic. He recognized that a strong organization required internal discipline and loyal intermediaries. Miranda provided exactly that. He enforced Genovese's vision quietly, ensuring that orders were carried out without friction or misunderstanding. Unlike others who sought proximity to the boss for personal advancement, Miranda sought proximity to the system itself. He focused on keeping operations smooth rather than elevating his own status. This made him unusually difficult to replace. As the Genovese family expanded its control over labor unions, construction, trucking, and gambling operations, Miranda played a behind-the-scenes role in maintaining those networks. He was not the face of these enterprises, but he understood their structure intimately. He knew where profits flowed, where vulnerabilities existed, and where discretion was essential. This knowledge increased his value even further. Miranda also helped enforce one of the Genovese family's most important rules: silence. Members were discouraged from discussing internal matters, even among themselves. Information was compartmentalized. Conversations were indirect. Meetings were limited and controlled. Miranda embodied this philosophy. He spoke only when necessary, and when he did, his words carried weight. This culture of silence frustrated law enforcement for decades. Wiretaps produced little. Informants struggled to gain meaningful access. Cases collapsed due to lack of evidence. While other families suffered major prosecutions, the Genovese organization remained largely intact, a testament to the system Miranda helped uphold. But this silence was not passive. It required constant maintenance. Miranda monitored behavior, identified potential threats, and quietly corrected issues before they escalated. He understood that loyalty could erode over time, especially as younger members entered the organization with different values. By reinforcing discipline and tradition, he helped preserve continuity across generations. This role placed him at the heart of the family's stability. He was not feared in the traditional sense. He was relied upon, and in the Mafia, reliance is the truest measure of power. In the next segment, we'll examine how Miranda's influence extended beyond New York, shaping relationships with other crime families and reinforcing the Genovese family's reputation as the most respected and feared organization in American organized crime history. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The man everyone trusted. How Big Mike became untouchable. Michele Big Mike Miranda occupied a position that almost no one else in the American Mafia ever achieved. He was powerful without being threatening, influential without being visible, and trusted across multiple generations of leadership. In a criminal world built on suspicion, betrayal, and paranoia, that combination was almost unheard of. Trust in the Mafia was never given freely. It was earned slowly, tested constantly, and revoked without warning. Miranda understood this instinctively. From the earliest days of his rise, he made a deliberate choice. Never overreach, never boast, never force loyalty. He allowed trust to form organically through consistency. He showed up when needed, stayed silent when required, and never put personal ambition ahead of organizational stability. This behavior separated him from countless others who rose quickly and fell just as fast. Within the Genovese family, Miranda became known as someone whose word did not change. If he said a problem would be handled, it was handled. If he promised discretion, nothing leaked. If he was entrusted with sensitive information, it went no further. Over time, this predictability made him invaluable. Bosses came and went. Alliances shifted. Rivals disappeared. Miranda remained. One reason for his durability was his refusal to play politics openly. He did not align himself aggressively with any single faction within the family. Instead, he positioned himself as a stabilizer, someone whose loyalty was to the structure, not to personalities. This allowed him to survive leadership changes that destroyed others. When Vito Genovese consolidated power, Miranda was already seen as essential. When Genovese was later imprisoned, Miranda's standing did not diminish. Successive leaders viewed him not as a threat, but as an asset, a rare figure who could be trusted to keep things running smoothly during transitions. This neutrality was strategic. Miranda understood that ambition was dangerous when displayed openly. Many mobsters wanted to be seen as the next boss, the next power broker, the next legend. Miranda wanted none of that. His influence grew precisely because he did not demand recognition for it. Law enforcement never fully understood this. Investigators often searched for top guys based on visibility, flashy lifestyles, loud reputations, obvious command structures. Miranda avoided all of that. He lived quietly. He conducted business discreetly. He delegated without appearing to dominate. As a result, he rarely appeared at the center of investigations, even when he was deeply involved in decision-making. But within the Mafia, everyone knew who he was. Miranda's reputation extended beyond New York. Other crime families recognized him as a man whose presence signaled seriousness. When disputes arose between organizations, over territory, business arrangements, or protocol, Miranda's involvement suggested that the Genovese family was taking the matter seriously, but wanted resolution without escalation. This made him an effective intermediary. He spoke carefully, avoided insults, and framed decisions as mutually beneficial. His goal was never to humiliate or intimidate. It was to restore balance. This approach earned him respect even among rival families that otherwise distrusted Genovese leadership. Respect, in this context, did not mean affection. It meant reliability. Miranda also maintained strict personal discipline. He avoided unnecessary violence, excessive gambling, and reckless behavior that could compromise his judgment or attract attention. He understood that power required clarity, and clarity required restraint. This discipline extended to how he handled younger members. Rather than encouraging recklessness, Miranda reinforced traditional values: patience, obedience, discretion. He discouraged impulsive acts that could draw scrutiny. Over time, this helped shape a generation of Genovese members who valued longevity over notoriety. It was this culture that allowed the family to outlast rivals who burned brightly but briefly. By the time Miranda reached the peak of his influence, he was considered untouchable, not because he was feared, but because removing him would destabilize too many relationships. Too many operations depended on his presence. Too many leaders trusted his judgment. In a mafia, survival often depends on making yourself necessary. Miranda mastered that art. He did not rule through force. He ruled through function. And as long as he remained useful, calm, reliable, and invisible, the Genovese family had no reason to challenge him. In the next segment, we'll explore how Miranda's influence extended into national mafia politics, including his role in maintaining alliances between families and shaping the long-term strategy that kept the Genovese organization at the top of the underworld for decades. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Power Without a Crown. How Big Mike shaped the mafia from the shadows. By the time Michele, Big Mike, Miranda reached the height of his influence, he had achieved something few men in mafia history ever managed. He held immense power without ever wearing a crown. He was not the official boss. He was not the public face. He was not the name whispered in headlines or splashed across indictments. And yet, decisions that shaped the future of the American Mafia often passed quietly through him. This was not accidental. It was intentional. Miranda understood a truth that many mobsters never grasp. Visibility is liability. The more power a man openly claims, the more enemies he creates, both inside the organization and outside it. By staying just outside the spotlight, Miranda insulated himself from ambition-driven rivalries and law enforcement pressure alike. He became what some insiders later described as a structural boss, a man who did not issue orders loudly, but whose approval was required before major moves were made. When disputes arose between capos, Miranda was consulted. When territory disagreements threatened violence, Miranda mediated. When alliances with other families needed reassurance, Miranda spoke. He did not command through fear. He commanded through inevitability. Within the Genovese family, his role was often described as the man who made things make sense. In an organization where egos could spiral into bloodshed, Miranda had a talent for slowing situations down, reframing problems, and guiding outcomes without humiliating anyone involved. This made him indispensable. Younger members learned quickly that ignoring Miranda's guidance was unwise. Not because he would retaliate personally, but because doing so meant isolating yourself from the flow of information and support that kept men alive. Opportunities stopped coming. Protection thinned. Allies became distant. Miranda never had to threaten anyone. The system enforced his authority for him. His influence extended beyond New York City. During periods of tension between the Genovese family and other powerful organizations, particularly the Gambino and Lucchese families, Miranda often served as a quiet bridge. He had relationships that predated many conflicts, stretching back to an earlier generation of mafia leadership that valued diplomacy over spectacle. These older ties mattered. Miranda had come up during a time when the Mafia still adhered closely to Sicilian traditions. Respect for hierarchy, patience in decision-making, and the belief that stability was more profitable than chaos. As the American Mafia modernized and expanded, many leaders abandoned those principles in favor of rapid expansion and aggressive tactics. Miranda did not. Instead, he adapted selectively. He allowed modernization where it strengthened the organization, but resisted changes that risked exposure or internal fracture. This made him a stabilizing force during times when the Mafia was under increasing pressure for federal investigations and internal power struggles. Ironically, this same stability made him difficult for law enforcement to understand. Investigators often looked for power in obvious places: flashy bosses, violent enforcers, men with large public footprints. Miranda fit none of those profiles. His quiet lifestyle, lack of public conflict, and avoidance of spectacle made him appear less important than he truly was. Even when his name appeared in intelligence reports, it was often buried beneath louder figures. This allowed him to operate with remarkable freedom. Behind the scenes, Miranda helped shape long-term strategies that prioritized survival over dominance. He supported policies that limited unnecessary violence, reduced public exposure, and discouraged reckless behavior. These choices may not have generated headlines, but they prolonged the life of the organization. In many ways, the Genovese family's reputation as the most disciplined and least visible of the five families can be traced back to Miranda's influence. He believed that power should feel boring. When power becomes exciting, it attracts attention. When it attracts attention, it invites destruction. Miranda also played a role in mentoring future leaders, not through speeches or formal instruction, but through example. Younger members observe how he conducted himself: calm, deliberate, restrained. They saw how longevity followed discipline, how silence often achieved more than aggression. These lessons outlived him. As other families suffered devastating blows from informants, internal wars, and aggressive prosecutions, the Genovese organization remained comparatively intact. This was not luck. It was the product of decades of careful leadership choices, many of which Miranda helped shape. By the later years of his life, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda had become a kind of living institution. Removing him would have created uncertainty, and uncertainty was dangerous. So he remained, quietly guiding, advising, and stabilizing until the end. He never ruled publicly. He never sought fame. He never needed recognition. His power came from something far rarer in the Mafia world: trust, patience, and restraint. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Miranda navigated the most dangerous period in American Mafia history: the rise of federal racketeering laws, informants, and surveillance, and how his low-profile strategy helped him survive when so many others did not. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Storm Gathers. The Mafia enters the age of surveillance. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the world Michele "Big Mike" Miranda had grown up and was disappearing. The American Mafia had once thrived in an environment of loose laws, limited coordination between police departments, and a public that preferred not to ask too many questions. That era was ending. A new storm was gathering. Federal law enforcement, long fragmented and cautious, began to reorganize with a singular focus: dismantling organized crime not through individual arrests, but by attacking its structure. The Mafia was no longer viewed as a collection of isolated criminals. It was now understood as a national criminal enterprise, and that understanding changed everything. For men like Miranda, this shift represented the most dangerous challenge of their lives. Not rival gangs, not internal betrayals, but a government learning how the Mafia truly worked. Congressional hearings exposed the existence of organized crime networks. The FBI, once hesitant to acknowledge the mafia's reach, began building dedicated units to study hierarchy, finances, and communication patterns. Informants were cultivated more aggressively. Surveillance technology improved. Wiretaps, bugs, and long-term intelligence operations became the new weapons of choice. The mafia was no longer fighting men. It was fighting systems. Many mob leaders responded the wrong way. Some doubled down on violence, believing fear could still solve problems. Others flaunted their power, assuming their status made them untouchable. A few underestimated the threat entirely, convinced that tradition and silence would protect them as it always had. Miranda did none of these things. Instead, he recognized the shift early. He saw that the old rules were being rewritten and that survival depended on adapting before it was too late. While louder bosses continued to conduct business as they always had, Miranda quietly began altering how influence was exercised. Meetings became smaller. Conversations became shorter. Decisions were filtered through fewer people. Where others spoke freely, Miranda spoke cautiously. Where others trusted reputation, he trusted patterns. He paid close attention to arrests that didn't make sense, indictments that relied on insider knowledge, and investigations that seemed unusually precise. To him, these were not coincidences. They were signs of infiltration. Miranda understood something deeply unsettling. The mafia's greatest strength, its secrecy, was also its greatest vulnerability. If even one trusted man spoke, entire networks could unravel. And as law enforcement pressure increased, the temptation to cooperate grew stronger. So Miranda began operating under a new assumption. Anyone could be compromised. This did not make him paranoid. It made him precise. He reduced his exposure by limiting direct involvement in operational crimes. He positioned himself as an advisor rather than an executor. He avoided handling money personally. He discouraged unnecessary contact between layers of the organization. And most importantly, he avoided creating records. No phone calls when possible. No written notes. No patterns that could be easily mapped. This approach made him frustrating for investigators. They could sense his importance, but struggled to define it clearly. He appeared at meetings, but rarely led them. He was respected, but not flamboyant. He influenced outcomes, but left little evidence of how. This ambiguity became a shield. As federal agencies refined their tactics, many mafia figures found themselves exposed by their own habits. Predictable routines, trusted drivers who became informants, long-standing relationships that suddenly turned into liabilities. Miranda watched these men fall, not with satisfaction, but with confirmation. Each arrest reinforced his belief that restraint was the only viable path forward. While others competed for dominance, Miranda competed for longevity. He understood that the mafia's future would not belong to the loudest or the most violent, but to the most disciplined, to those who could blend into the background while still pulling strings. This philosophy extended beyond his own behavior. Miranda quietly encouraged others to adopt similar caution. He advised against reckless expansion. He urged patience during conflicts. He discouraged retaliation that could draw attention. Not everyone listened. Those who ignored this advice often paid the price. By the mid-1960s, indictments were becoming more sophisticated. Prosecutors began using conspiracy charges to link individuals who had never directly committed crimes together. The concept of collective responsibility under the law threatened the very foundation of mafia organization. Miranda grasped the danger immediately. If leadership could be punished simply for being connected, then visibility itself became criminal. And in that world, silence was no longer just a code, It was a survival strategy. As younger mobsters grew impatient and older ones clung to outdated practices, Miranda stood between generations, quietly steering the organization away from disaster. He did not fight the system head-on. He flowed around it. This ability to adapt without appearing to change is what allowed him to endure when so many others did not. By the time federal racketeering laws loomed on the horizon, laws that would devastate entire crime families, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda was already living as if they existed. He did not wait for the storm to hit. He prepared for it in silence. In the next segment, we'll examine how this quiet adaptability allowed Miranda to survive an era that destroyed legends, and why his name remains far less known than those who failed to evolve. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Survival as Strategy. How Big Mike outlasted an era of betrayal. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the American Mafia was no longer operating in the shadows it once enjoyed. Federal law enforcement had changed its approach. Long-term surveillance, informants, wiretaps, and sweeping conspiracy cases began dismantling organizations that had seemed untouchable only a decade earlier. Many powerful men did not adapt in time. Michele "Big Mike" Miranda did. What separated Miranda from others was not intelligence alone, but temperament. He understood something deeply unsettling about the mafia world. Ambition killed faster than bullets. The men who rose too quickly, spoke too loudly, or demanded recognition rarely lived long or stayed free. Miranda chose a different path. He treated survival as a discipline. While others reacted emotionally to shifting power, Miranda moved slowly and deliberately. He did not align himself publicly with any single rising star. He avoided becoming entangled in personal vendettas. When tensions grew between factions, he positioned himself just far enough away to remain neutral, yet close enough to remain informed. This balance was difficult to maintain. The mafia thrived on loyalty, but loyalty often demanded visible commitment. Miranda redefined loyalty as discretion. He supported leaders privately, offered counsel quietly, and avoided situations that required public displays of allegiance. This allowed him to adjust when leadership changed, without appearing disloyal. As informants began emerging inside organized crime families, paranoia spread. Longtime allies were suddenly suspected. Decades-old friendships collapsed overnight. Meetings became tense, guarded, and short. Miranda responded by reducing his exposure. He limited the number of people who could directly implicate him. He avoided unnecessary meetings. He delegated through trusted intermediaries rather than appearing himself. When he did meet, it was often in mundane settings that attracted little attention. He also understood the value of silence. While others defended themselves loudly against rumors or accusations, Miranda said very little. In a world where words could be recorded, repeated, or misinterpreted, silence became his shield. This made him difficult to read, but also difficult to accuse. Law enforcement noticed him, but struggled to define him. He was never the loudest voice, never the visible boss, never the obvious target. Files mentioned him, but rarely placed him at the center of criminal activity. Witnesses spoke around him, not about him. He existed as a connective presence rather than a command figure. This frustrated prosecutors deeply. They suspected his importance, but lacked the narrative clarity needed to bring charges. Miranda's strength lay in the absence of evidence, not because he was inactive, but because he had structured his role to avoid leaving trail. Meanwhile, the mafia world around him was collapsing. High-ranking figures were sentenced to long prison terms. Others were murdered. Some became informants themselves. The structure that had once been stable grew brittle under pressure. Entire crews were dismantled through testimony and surveillance. Miranda watched all of this without panic. He had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. He had avoided flashy crimes. He had discouraged unnecessary violence. He had prioritized long-term stability over short-term profit. These choices did not make him popular with reckless earners, but they earned him something far more valuable: endurance. Within the Genovese family, his continued presence became reassuring. As chaos spread, Miranda represented continuity. He was a reminder of an older way of operating, one based on patience and restraint. Younger members who had never experienced stability looked to him as a stabilizing reference point. Even those who disagreed with him respected his longevity. Longevity in this world was proof of wisdom. Miranda also benefited from something many mobsters lacked: restraint and ego. He did not need to be remembered as the most powerful. He did not chase legacy. He seemed content knowing that influence mattered more than recognition. This mindset protected him when others fell. When leadership shifted again and again, Miranda adapted without resistance. He neither challenged new leaders nor competed with them. Instead, he offered continuity, helping transitions occur without internal collapse. In doing so, he became a living bridge between generations. He had known the founders, he advised their successors, and he remained present as the organization moved into a more cautious, less visible phase. Few men could claim such a span of relevance. By the time Miranda's health began to decline, his survival itself had become symbolic. He had outlasted rivals who were stronger, louder, and more feared. He had endured decades of betrayal without becoming a victim of it. Not because he was untouchable, but because he was careful. His story challenges the common image of mafia power. It suggests that the most dangerous men were not always those who pulled triggers or issued commands. Sometimes they were the ones who waited, listened, and stayed silent while others destroyed themselves. In the end, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda did not dominate the mafia through fear or force, that he survived it. And in surviving, he shaped it more profoundly than many men whose names are far better known. In the next chapter, we will step deeper into Miranda's role within the Genovese family itself, examining how his quiet leadership influenced policy, prevented internal wars, and helped define what would become the most disciplined and secretive crime family in American history. Chapter 3, Segment 2, Power Without a Face: How Big Mike Ruled by Absence. There is a common misconception about power in the mafia. Many imagine it as something loud, visible, and constantly asserted. In reality, the most durable power often belonged to those who could remove themselves from the spotlight while still shaping every outcome behind it. Michele "Big Mike" Miranda mastered this form of control. By the mid-1960s, his influence inside the Genovese family was no longer defined by titles or public authority. It was defined by trust. When disputes arose, his opinion carried weight even when he was not formally in charge. When alliances were tested, his approval mattered. When leaders hesitated, they quietly sought his guidance. This kind of influence cannot be demanded. It must be earned over decades. Miranda earned it through consistency. He did not shift loyalties impulsively. He did not chase short-term gains at the expense of stability. He was known as a man whose word did not change depending on who was in the room. In a world built on deception, this reliability made him invaluable. Other bosses understood something critical about Miranda. He did not need to dominate to be dangerous. His strength lay in his ability to connect people who could not trust each other directly. He became a bridge between factions, generations, and philosophies. When rival crews within the family clashed, Miranda often served as the quiet intermediary. He listened more than he spoke. He absorbed grievances without inflaming them. And when he finally offered advice, it was framed not as an order, but as an inevitability. This approach made resistance unnecessary. Those who followed his guidance felt they were choosing the smartest path themselves. Those who ignored it often found their position weakening over time, not through confrontation, but through isolation. Miranda rarely punished anyone directly. He let circumstances do the work. This was especially important during periods of leadership uncertainty. As powerful figures were imprisoned, deported, or assassinated, the Genovese family required internal balance more than brute force. Miranda helped maintain that balance by discouraging sudden power grabs and encouraging continuity. He believed chaos attracted attention, and attention was the enemy. Unlike flashier mobsters, Miranda avoided unnecessary displays of wealth. His lifestyle was modest by mafia standards. He did not cultivate a public image. He did not surround himself with large entourages. He blended into the rhythm of ordinary life, making him difficult to distinguish from countless other men in New York. This invisibility served two purposes. First, it protected him from law enforcement. Investigators struggled to justify dedicating resources to a man who left so few traces. Second, it protected the organization itself. By not becoming a symbol, Miranda ensured that the Genovese family could function without being defined by any single personality. This was a lesson learned from watching others fail. Miranda had seen what happened when bosses became celebrities in their own underworld. Their names leaked into newspapers. Their movements were tracked. Their associates were mapped. Eventually, their organizations collapsed under the weight of scrutiny. Miranda refused to let that happen again. Instead, he operated like a stabilizing force, present enough to guide, distant enough to remain untouched. He allowed others to hold visible positions while he maintained influence quietly. This separation between authority and appearance became one of the Genovese family's greatest strengths. Inside the organization, this earned him respect bordering on reverence. Men who might challenge a loud boss would never challenge Miranda. Not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. They believed he saw the long game more clearly than anyone else. And often he did. As federal pressure increased, Miranda's low-profile strategy proved increasingly effective. While others were called before grand juries or named in investigations, his name surfaced rarely, if at all. He was known to law enforcement, but never fully understood. This ambiguity frustrated prosecutors. They sensed his importance, yet could not tie him directly to crimes. He existed in the negative space of investigations, influential but elusive. For Miranda, this was not luck. It was design. He had spent years shaping a role that allowed him to remain indispensable without being exposed. He avoided direct command, preferring advisory influence. He avoided visible disputes, preferring quiet consensus. He avoided urgency, preferring patience. In doing so, he created a form of power that could not easily be removed. Even when leadership shifted, even when alliances changed, Miranda remained relevant. His presence was constant like gravity, unseen but always felt. This is why his story is so often overlooked. History tends to remember the men who shouted the loudest or fell the hardest. It forgets those who endured. But within the Mafia, endurance was the ultimate achievement. Michele Big Mike, Miranda did not rise by force. He did not rule by fear. He ruled by being necessary. In the next segment, we will explore how this quiet authority allowed Miranda to outlast rivals, navigate internal betrayals, and survive an era that destroyed many of the Mafia's most famous names, while he remained almost invisibly at the center of it all. Chapter 4. Segment 1. The quiet architecture of power. Miranda inside the Genovese family. To understand Michele, Big Mike, Miranda's true importance, it is necessary to step inside the structure he helped stabilize, the Genovese crime family. More than any other mafia organization in America, the Genovese family became known for discipline, secrecy, and internal control. That reputation did not happen by accident. It was engineered. By the time Miranda reached senior status, the Genovese family had already learned hard lessons from chaos. Public violence attracted attention. Emotional leadership created fractures. Ego-driven decisions brought federal pressure. The family that survived would be the one that learned to disappear without dissolving. Miranda became one of the architects of that philosophy. He did not create policy through orders. He shaped it through influence. Within the Genovese structure, leadership rarely relied on overt commands. Instead, decisions were reached through consensus among trusted elders. Miranda was often one of those voices, not the loudest, but the most listened to. His value lay in judgment. When disputes arose between crews, Miranda assessed them not by loyalty or profit, but by risk. Would this conflict attract law enforcement? Would it destabilize alliances? Would it fracture internal trust? If the answer was yes, he quietly intervened. Intervention, in Miranda's world, rarely looked like authority. It looked like conversation. He would speak privately with both sides. He would remind them of consequences rather than threaten them. He would frame compromise as survival, not weakness. Many conflicts ended not because someone won, but because Miranda made escalation seem irrational. This approach reshaped how power functioned. Violence became a last resort rather than a reflex. Decisions slowed. Planning became deliberate. The Genovese family began to resemble an administrative body rather than a street gang. That evolution allowed it to remain functional long after other families were weakened by infighting. Miranda also played a key role in insulating leadership. He believed that bosses should not be visible. Public reputation invited scrutiny. Charisma attracted attention. He encouraged leaders to operate through buffers, capos, intermediaries, and trusted messengers. This created layers of separation between decision makers and criminal acts. As a result, law enforcement often struggled to identify who was truly in charge. Miranda supported this ambiguity. He understood that confusion was a defense. If no one could clearly identify leadership, prosecutions became more difficult. Testimony became unreliable. Surveillance lacked focus. This structural invisibility became one of the Genovese family's greatest strengths. Internally, Miranda reinforced another principle: patience. He discouraged impulsive earning schemes. He warned against unnecessary expansion. He emphasized sustainability over dominance. In meetings, he often redirected discussions away from short-term gains toward long-term stability. This made him seem conservative to some. Younger members wanted rapid success. They wanted recognition. They wanted to build reputations. Miranda saw these desires as liabilities. He believed that the men who rushed forward would eventually draw attention and fall. Time proved him correct. As federal cases mounted against flashier families, the Genovese organization remained comparatively intact. Arrests occurred, but leadership continuity survived. Internal betrayals were fewer. Informants were less effective. The structure absorbed pressure rather than collapsing under it. Miranda's influence extended into succession planning as well. He supported leaders who valued discretion. He discouraged those driven by ego. When leadership changes were inevitable, he helped guide transitions smoothly, reducing the likelihood of violent power struggles. This quiet succession management was rare in organized crime. Other families tore themselves apart when leaders fell. The Genovese family adapted. That adaptability was not accidental. It was the result of decades of cultural reinforcement, much of it shaped by a man like Miranda. He also helped define boundaries between families. Rather than escalating territorial disputes, he promoted negotiation. He understood that inter-family wars benefited no one except law enforcement. Maintaining predictable relationships reduced unpredictability, and unpredictability attracted attention. Miranda's approach turned the Genovese family into something resembling an institution, not humane, not lawful, but structured. Within that structure, loyalty was expected, but blind obedience was not. Decisions were debated, risks were weighed, emotion was restrained. These qualities allowed the family to persist while others fractured. Miranda's presence reinforced these norms. Even those who disagreed with him respected his reasoning. He rarely pushed his own agenda. He framed arguments around survival rather than authority. This made it difficult to oppose him without appearing reckless. Over time, his influence became invisible, embedded in how the family operated rather than attached to his name. This invisibility was his greatest achievement. When historians later searched for figures who shaped the Mafia's most enduring organization, Miranda's name appeared quietly, often without explanation. He left few public statements, few dramatic moments, few headlines, but the system bore his fingerprints. In the next segment, we will examine how this system responded under extreme pressure, as federal prosecutions intensified and the modern era of organized crime began closing. We will see how Miranda's philosophy was tested, and how his quiet influence helped the Genovese family endure when survival itself became uncertain. Chapter 4, Segment 3, The Price of Silence, How Power Became Loneliness. By the time Michele, Big Mike, Miranda entered the final phase of his influence, power no longer looked the way outsiders imagined it. There were no lavish celebrations, no public acknowledgement, no sense of victory. What remained was responsibility, heavy, constant, and isolated. Silence had kept him alive, but silence had also taken nearly everything else. Miranda lived in a world where trust was conditional and temporary. Every conversation carried weight. Every relationship had limits. Even loyalty, the currency of organized crime, came with expiration dates. T.O. survived decades in the Mafia was to accept emotional distance as a form of armor. Miranda understood this early, but as years passed, the cost became clearer. He could not speak openly, even among allies. He could not express doubt, fear, or regret. Weakness, even philosophical weakness, created vulnerability. So he absorbed everything quietly. Unlike flashier bosses, Miranda did not surround himself with large entourages. His inner circle was narrow and carefully maintained. Fewer people meant fewer risks, but it also meant fewer human connections. Power, for Miranda, became a solitary condition that he spent much of his later life removed from daily operations, yet never disconnected. He was consulted rather than commanded, sought out rather than seen. This position gave him influence without exposure, but it also placed him in a strange limbo, present everywhere, yet nowhere fully. Younger members often knew his name without knowing him, but he was spoken about in lowered voices, referred to indirectly, treated as an authority figure whose approval mattered deeply, even when he was physically absent. This reinforced his mystique, but it also deepened his isolation. Miranda rarely appeared at social events. When he did, he stayed briefly, observed, listened, departed without explanation. He avoided forming habits that others could track. His daily life became predictable only to himself. This discipline extended to his personal relationships. Friendships outside the criminal world were limited. Too many questions created risk. Too much familiarity invited curiosity. Miranda preferred distance to explanation. Family relationships, too, were shaped by caution. Loved ones knew little about his activities. This was not cruelty, it was protection. Knowledge, even accidental, could destroy lives. Miranda lived with the understanding that anyone close to him carried danger simply by proximity. This weighed on him as the years passed. The mafia he had helped stabilize no longer resembled the one he had entered. The sense of fraternity had eroded. Fear of informants replaced trust. Legal pressure replaced territorial warfare. Miranda observed this shift with resignation rather than anger. He did not romanticize the past. He did not believe the old days were better, only less exposed. He recognized that time itself was the enemy of secrecy. Technology, bureaucracy, and public awareness had reshaped the battlefield in private conversations. He reportedly acknowledged that organized crime would never again hold the same power it once had. Not because it had lost intelligence, but because it had lost invisibility. This acceptance defined his final years. Rather than resist change, Miranda leaned into restraint. He encouraged younger leaders to lower expectations, reduce ambition, and focus on longevity rather than expansion. Tio many. This sounded like surrender Tio Miranda. It was realism that he believed survival was success. That philosophy extended to how he prepared for the end of his life. Unlike others who sought monuments or legacies, Miranda made no effort to preserve his image. He left no memoirs, gave no interviews, created no myth. He understood that stories attract attention, and attention attracts scrutiny. When his health declined, he withdrew further. His involvement became advisory rather than operational. His voice still mattered, but it spoke less often. This withdrawal was intentional. Miranda believed that staying too long at the center of influence invited downfall. Power, when held openly, eventually provoked challenge. By fading gradually, he allowed the structure to adjust without disruption. His departure from prominence was so quiet that many barely noticed it happening. When he eventually died, there were no public acknowledgments. No headlines, no spectacle. Within the mafia world, his passing was noted respectfully, but without ceremony. That was exactly how he would have wanted it. His true legacy was not an empire, but a method, a way of operating that prioritized patience over aggression, silence over speech, stability over domination. The Genovese family endured not because it was the most violent, but because it was the most restrained. Miranda's influence was embedded in its culture long after his direct involvement in it. History often remembers the loudest figures. Miranda was not one of them. Yet without him, many louder figures would not have survived long enough to be remembered at all in the next chapter. We will explore how Miranda's philosophy influenced the next generation of leadership, and how his quiet hand continued shaping decisions even after he was no longer present to give guidance. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Surviving the Storm, Miranda and the Age of Federal Pressure. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the world around Michele, Big Mike, Miranda began to change in ways that could not be managed quietly. The mafia was no longer an invisible rumor whispered in neighborhoods. It was becoming a national obsession. Congressional hearings, Senate investigations, newspaper exposés, wiretaps, informants. The era of silence was under siege. For Miranda, this period represented the greatest test of everything he believed about power, restraint, and survival. The old rules, intimidation, secrecy, and loyalty were no longer enough. Law enforcement was no longer reactive. It was strategic. The federal government had learned how to watch. The turning point came with public acknowledgement of the mafia's existence. Once the government stopped pretending organized crime did not exist, the balance shifted permanently. The Appalachian meeting in 1957 confirmed what authorities had long suspected: a national criminal network operating with hierarchy and coordination. For men like Miranda, Appalachian was a warning. He understood immediately that visibility was now lethal. The era of gathering dozens of leaders in one place was over. The era of casual meetings, open conversations, and relaxed travel was ending. Every movement would now be interpreted as evidence. Miranda responded not with panic, but with tightening. Meetings became smaller. Communication became indirect. Orders traveled through trusted intermediaries rather than direct contact. Sensitive discussions moved away from predictable locations. The family's internal discipline hardened. Miranda advocated for what he called insulation, that he believed that leaders should know less, not more. Knowledge created vulnerability. If a man could not testify to something he did not know, he could not betray it. This principle reshaped how information flowed. Capos were no longer briefed on every decision. Soldiers were compartmentalized. Each layer knew only what it needed to function. This made the organization slower, but far safer. Law enforcement found itself chasing shadows. Miranda also supported the reduction of unnecessary violence during this period. Murders drew headlines. Headlines drew pressure. Pressure produced task forces. Task forces produced indictments that he argued that intimidation could be replaced with leverage, debt, influence, business entanglements, political relationships. Violence, when used, became surgical rather than expressive. This frustrated younger members who believed fear was the foundation of control. Miranda believed fear attracted witnesses. His position gained credibility as federal cases multiplied. Men who had relied on brute force were suddenly imprisoned. Others fled. Some turned informant. The Genovese family, while affected, remained comparatively stable. Leadership losses occurred, but the structure endured. That Miranda's ability to read long-term consequences proved invaluable. When wiretaps became more common, he discouraged phone use entirely for sensitive matters. Conversations returned to face-to-face interactions, often conducted while walking, driving, or engaging in mundane activities to avoid suspicion. He encouraged leaders to appear ordinary in flashy clothing. No obvious buttons, no public displays of wealth. He believed invisibility was protection. A man who blended into his surroundings was less likely to be noticed and less likely to be remembered. This philosophy contrasted sharply with the popular image of mob bosses. While others cultivated fearsome reputations, Miranda cultivated forgettability. He avoided nightlife scenes. He minimized public presence. He did not seek recognition within his own world. That restraint saved him as federal prosecutors built cases based on association and pattern. Miranda's name rarely surfaced with urgency. He was present, but never central. Known, but not emphasized. Respected, but not flamboyant. That he also understood the psychological pressure law enforcement applied. Interrogations were no longer about immediate evidence. They were about endurance, fatigue, isolation, promises, threats. Miranda quietly encouraged legal preparation long before arrests occurred. He urged men to retain competent attorneys early. He warned against speaking casually to authorities. He emphasized that silence was not defiance, it was survival. This advice prevented countless self-inflicted wounds. He also monitored loyalty carefully, not through paranoia, but through observation. Men under stress revealed themselves. Some talked too much. Some drank excessively. Some sought attention. Miranda took note of these behaviors, not to punish, but to limit exposure. Those deemed unstable were quietly distanced from sensitive matters. This internal risk management was crucial as the government turned former mobsters into witnesses. The Genovese family produced fewer high-level informants than many rivals. That was not luck. It was cultural conditioning. Miranda helped build a culture where patience was valued over bravado and restraint over aggression. He also supported adaptability. When traditional rackets became risky, he encouraged diversification. Legitimate businesses provided cover and income. Union influence became quieter. Gambling moved indoors. Everything shifted away from visibility. By the late 1960s, organized crime was no longer expanding. It was consolidating. Miranda understood that consolidation was not defeat. It was survival, while others clung to the past. He prepared for a future where the mafia would exist in reduced form, smaller, quieter, but persistent. This realism separated him from romanticized mob legends. He did not believe the mafia was eternal. He believed it could endure only if it accepted limitation. His guidance helped the Genovese family make that adjustment. When major prosecutions finally arrived in later decades, the family suffered losses, but it did not implode. Its foundation had been reinforced long before that. Miranda's legacy during this era was not dominance, but continuity. He did not defeat the federal government. He outlasted momentary crises by teaching his organization how to bend without breaking. In the next segment, we will examine the personal cost of this survival, how Miranda lived during these years of pressure, how isolation became a form of protection, and how his quiet existence reflected the philosophy he had imposed on the criminal empire around him. Chapter 5, Segment 1, The Quiet Architect, how Big Mike shaped the Genovese future. When Michele Big Mike Miranda stepped back from daily power, the Genovese crime family did not weaken. It adapted, and that adaptation was not accidental. It was the result of decades of quiet preparation, subtle guidance, and a philosophy that valued endurance over dominance. Miranda had never believed in ruling through fear alone. Fear was unstable. It burned fast and drew attention. What lasted, he believed, was structure, process, predictability, a system that functioned even when the man at the center disappeared. That belief shaped how he mentored those who followed him. Rather than grooming a single successor, Miranda encouraged collective leadership. Power, he felt, should never rest entirely in one set of hands. Concentrated authority created obvious targets. Distributed authority created confusion, and confusion protected the organization. This approach influenced the Genovese family more than any single decision he ever made. Younger captains were taught to avoid ego. They were discouraged from flamboyance, flashy spending, public arguments, unnecessary violence. All of it was seen as weakness rather than strength. Miranda often reminded them that the most dangerous man in the room was the one nobody noticed. This mindset ran counter to popular images of the mafia. Hollywood portrayed bosses as loud, theatrical figures issuing commands from lavish offices. Miranda rejected that entirely. He owe him. Power worked best when it was invisible. Under his influence, the Genovese family became known, even among other crime families, as the most disciplined and least chaotic organization in New York. They made fewer mistakes. They attracted less media attention. They avoided unnecessary wars. That reputation was not accidental. Miranda encouraged a culture of caution. Meetings were smaller. Communication was indirect. Decisions were slow and deliberate. Violence was treated as a last resort rather than a tool of expression. This restraint frustrated more aggressive members, but Miranda was unmoved. He believed impatience destroyed organizations faster than law enforcement ever could. One of his most enduring lessons was this: Survival required humility. Ambition was not eliminated, it was managed. Those who wanted more power were given responsibility, not spotlight. Those who sought recognition were quietly sidelined. Miranda understood human nature well enough to know that people revealed themselves over time. His leadership style allowed ambition to surface naturally, without confrontation. Those who proved reckless removed themselves. Those who remained learned patience. This filtering effect shaped the Genovese hierarchy long after Miranda stopped attending meetings. Even leaders who never worked closely with him absorbed his philosophy indirectly. Through tradition and example, I in this way, Miranda became less of a leader and more of an institution. His influence extended beyond personnel decisions. He quietly supported operational changes that reduced exposure. Illegal activities were compartmentalized. Knowledge was limited on a need-to-know basis. Financial structures became more complex and less traceable. Miranda encouraged investments that blended into legitimate business landscapes. Construction, waste management, labor contracts, industries where influence could be exercised subtly, without overt control, but he also emphasized adaptability. When law enforcement tactics changed, Miranda pushed the organization to change faster. Surveillance, wiretaps, informants. All of these were treated as evolving threats rather than fixed dangers. This forward-thinking approach was rare in organized crime, where tradition often overpowered logic. Miranda respected tradition, but he did not worship it. He believed that clinging too tightly to old methods was another form of arrogance. The world changed. Organizations that refused to change with it were destined to collapse. That belief proved accurate. While other crime families fractured under pressure, the Genovese structure held. It did not dominate headlines. It did not inspire fear in the public imagination. It simply endured. Even federal investigators quietly acknowledged this resilience. The Genovese family was notoriously difficult to penetrate. Cases took longer. Evidence was thinner. Informants were rarer. This was not because the family was smaller or weaker, but because it was quieter. Miranda's philosophy had turned discretion into a survival mechanism, but he never claimed credit for this. In fact, he actively avoided being associated with strategic decisions. Praise created attention. Attention created vulnerability. Instead, Miranda allowed others to appear as decision makers while he influenced outcomes from behind the scenes. This anonymity was deliberate, in private. He reportedly expressed satisfaction not with wealth or recognition, but with continuity. The idea that the organization could function without him was his greatest achievement. That T.O. Miranda. That meant he had succeeded. His absence did not create a vacuum. It revealed a system strong enough to continue without visible leadership. This is the mark of true influence, not control, but permanence. As the years passed, newer generations inherited an organization shaped by restraint, patience, and discipline. Many did not know Miranda personally. Some knew only his name. Others knew only the rules he had embedded. Yet his presence lingered in how decisions were made. In the next segment, we will examine how this philosophy was tested during moments of crisis. When law enforcement pressure intensified, alliances shifted, and the Genovese family faced threats that could have undone decades of careful planning. And we will see how Miranda's quiet blueprint continued to guide responses, even when his voice was no longer there to offer guidance. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Stability Through Silence. Big Mike's philosophy in times of crisis. Criminal organizations are rarely destroyed by a single blow. More often, they collapse under the weight of panic. Arrests trigger fear. Fear creates mistakes, and mistakes multiply until the structure gives way. Michele Big Mike Miranda understood this long before federal prosecutors put a name to it. For Miranda, the greatest danger to any organization was not law enforcement itself, but the internal chaos that followed pressure. He believed most crime families were undone not by evidence, but by emotion, rage, ego, desperation. His response to crisis was silence. When arrests occurred, Miranda discouraged immediate reaction. No emergency meetings, no decisions, no attempts at retaliation. He insisted that stillness was a form of control. To outsiders, this restraint appeared passive. To insiders, it was discipline. Miranda believed that the moment a group reacted emotionally, it revealed its weaknesses. Law enforcement thrived on reaction. Surveillance units expected sudden movement. Informants waited for frantic conversations. Prosecutors anticipated panic-driven mistakes. Miranda gave them none of it. Instead, he pushed for time. Time allowed fear to settle. Time allowed false assumptions to reveal themselves. Time allowed investigators to overextend or lose momentum. That he treated every crisis as a test of character. Those who could wait were trusted. Those who could not were quietly removed from influence. This approach shaped how the Genovese family responded to some of the most aggressive federal campaigns of the 20th century. When other crime families reacted with internal purges or reckless violence, the Genovese response was measured. Communication slowed. Activities were temporarily scaled back. Meetings were postponed or canceled altogether. Miranda believed that doing nothing was often safer than doing something. This philosophy frustrated younger members who equated action with strength. But Miranda saw restraint as powered. In his view, real authority was the ability to absorb pressure without changing behavior. He also emphasized compartmentalization during times of scrutiny. Information was restricted further. Long-standing relationships were paused rather than severed. Familiar routines were altered subtly, without explanation. This created confusion, not just for investigators, but within the organization itself. Miranda understood that uncertainty prevented coordinated mistakes. When people did not know the full picture, they could not inadvertently expose it. Critically, he discouraged scapegoating that in many crime families, arrest trigger blame. Someone must have talked. Someone must have failed. Miranda rejected this instinct. Blame fractured loyalty. Fractured loyalty created informants. Unless there was absolute certainty, Miranda refused to accuse. Suspicion was kept private. Decisions were delayed. Accusations were avoided. This restraint preserved internal cohesion. Over time, members learned that survival did not require proving innocence loudly. Silence was often enough. Miranda also placed enormous value on legal patience. He advised members to trust attorneys rather than instincts, to speak less, not more, to accept temporary losses rather than risk permanent exposure. In an era when many mobsters saw lawyers as secondary tools, Miranda treated legal strategy as central to survival, that he believed that courtroom outcomes were shaped long before trials began, by behavior, by consistency, by discipline. His guidance helped the Genovese family avoid the dramatic collapses that plagued rival organizations. While other families were dismantled through sweeping indictments and high-profile defections, the Genovese structure endured with fewer public implosions. This did not mean they were untouched by law enforcement. It meant they were harder to finish, that Miranda's crisis philosophy extended beyond arrests. It also shaped how the family handled internal disputes. When conflict arose between captains or crews, Miranda discouraged immediate resolution. He believed forced solutions created resentment. Instead, he allowed tensions to cool naturally. Time, he believed, exposed motivations. Those seeking resolution would wait. Those seeking dominance would push. This observation guided his decisions. Rather than imposing authority, Miranda let behavior speak. Over weeks or months, patterns emerged. Alliances formed and dissolved. Ambition became visible. Only then would intervention occur, quietly, decisively, and without spectacle. This approach minimized internal violence. It reduced the number of unresolved grudges, and it reinforced a culture where patience was rewarded. That Miranda's methods were not rooted in kindness. They were rooted in realism, that he understood that organizations survived not because of loyalty alone, but because of predictability. Members needed to believe that reactions would be consistent, rational, and restrained. This predictability created trust. Even those who disliked Miranda respected him. They knew he would not act impulsively. They knew he would not sacrifice stability for ego. That reputation became one of his greatest assets. As federal pressure intensified in the later decades of his influence, Miranda's philosophy proved its value again and again. The Genovese family adapted quietly. They contracted operations, shifted methods, avoided attention. They did not declare victory. They simply remained in a world where survival itself was success. That was enough. Why the time Miranda fully withdrew from active involvement. His approach had been internalized. It no longer required enforcement. It had become culture. New leaders inherited not just positions, but expectations, silence under pressure, restraint in crisis, patience over panic. In the next segment, we will explore how this philosophy ultimately shaped Miranda's own legacy. Not as a public figure, but as a stabilizing force whose influence outlived his presence and quietly defined an era of organized crime that valued endurance over infamy. Chapter 5, Segment 3. The Man Who Refused the Spotlight. How Miranda Preserved Power Without Fame. In the American Mafia, visibility was often mistaken for authority. The loudest boss, the most feared name, the man whose reputation traveled fastest through newspapers and courtrooms. For many, power meant being known. Michele "Big Mike" Miranda rejected that idea completely. That be why the time he reached the highest levels of the Genovese crime family. Miranda had already watched what visibility did to men like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Joe Valachi, and countless others. Fame attracted attention. Attention attracted law enforcement, and law enforcement eventually brought collapse. Miranda made a deliberate choice to remain unseen, but he did not cultivate a public persona. He avoided flashy displays of wealth. He stayed out of newspapers. He did not seek credit for decisions he influenced. In many cases, he allowed others to appear in control while quietly guiding outcomes from behind the scenes. This was not humility. It was strategy. Miranda believed that the safest position in any hierarchy was just below visibility. Close enough to influence decisions. Far enough to avoid scrutiny. When law enforcement built profiles of mafia leadership, they often focused on those who spoke, traveled, or appeared frequently. Miranda did none of these things. His movements were predictable. His routines were mundane. His name rarely surfaced in wiretaps or surveillance reports. This absence of noise became his shield. Even within the organization, Miranda limited how often he was seen. Meetings were rare and purposeful. He avoided gathering groups unnecessarily. He preferred one-on-one conversations, conducted briefly and without ceremony. This reduced risk. Fewer witnesses, fewer misunderstandings, fewer opportunities for betrayal. Miranda understood that every interaction carried exposure. The fewer interactions, the fewer vulnerabilities. That he also avoided personal feuds. Many mafia figures built reputations through conflict, settling scores, humiliating rivals. asserting dominance. Miranda avoided this entirely. He did not engage in public disputes. He did not challenge authority openly. When disagreements occurred, he addressed them privately or allowed them to resolve indirectly. This made him difficult to target. Without visible enemies, there were fewer incentives for retaliation. Without public confrontations, there were fewer grudges that could escalate into violence or testimony that Miranda's neutrality was not weakness. It was insulation that he also maintained distance from daily criminal operations. While deeply informed, he rarely involved himself in tactical details. He focused on structure, balance, and continuity rather than execution. This separation protected him legally and operationally, that if something went wrong, Miranda was not present. If someone was arrested, Miranda was not involved. If violence occurred, Miranda's role remained abstract and indirect. This allowed him to deny knowledge plausibly and often truthfully. Over time, this created an unusual dynamic. Miranda was widely respected, even feared, yet rarely discussed in detail. Younger members knew his name, but not his habits. Older members understood his importance, but struggled to define his exact role. This ambiguity was intentional. Power, Miranda believed, did not need to be explained. It needed to be felt. When disputes required resolution, his opinion carried weight. When leadership decisions were debated, his voice ended discussions. When alliances shifted, his approval was sought, yet he never announced authority. This allowed him to operate across factions without being seen as a threat. He was not competing for leadership. He was preserving stability. That Miranda's refusal of the spotlight also protected him during moments of transition. As bosses were arrested, died, or lost influence, Miranda remained. He was not associated with a single regime. He adapted quietly as leadership changed. This continuity made him indispensable. New bosses relied on his experience. Old bosses trusted his discretion. He became the institutional memory of the family, the keeper of norms, expectations, and unwritten rules. This role could not be replaced easily. Why avoiding visibility, Miranda ensured longevity. He survived eras that destroyed louder figures. He remained influential while others rose and fell dramatically. Even after stepping back from active involvement, his presence lingered. Decisions continued to reflect his philosophy. Structures he helped stabilize remained intact. When historians later examined the Genovese family's unusual resilience, Miranda's name appeared repeatedly, often without fanfare, without headlines, without sensational anecdotes. Just quiet consistency, in a world built on betrayal. He trusted invisibility more than loyalty. In an environment driven by ego, he chose restraint. Miranda proved that power did not require recognition. Sometimes, the most influential figure in a room was the one no one noticed speaking. In the next chapter, we will move beyond Miranda's internal philosophy and examine how his approach influenced the broader American Mafia, shaping how organized crime adapted to modern law enforcement, federal statutes, and a world where silence became the most valuable currency of all. Chapter 6, Segment 1, The Genovese Model, How Silence Became the Family's Greatest Weapon. By the middle of the 20th century, the American Mafia was changing. Federal law enforcement had grown more organized, more patient, and more technologically capable. Wiretaps, long-term surveillance, grand juries, and new conspiracy laws began to erode the old assumptions that had protected organized crime for decades. The era of flamboyant gangsters was coming to an end. Michele "Big Mike" Miranda understood this shift earlier than most. While other mafia leaders continued to operate as they always had, Miranda quietly adapted. He recognized that survival in the modern era would not depend on intimidation alone, but on structure, discipline, and silence. What emerged from this understanding became known, though rarely spoken aloud, as the Genovese model. At its core, the Genovese model was built on invisibility. Miranda believed that the greatest threat to organized crime was not violence, but exposure. The more visible a criminal organization became, the easier it was for law enforcement to map its hierarchy, identify its leadership, and dismantle it piece by piece. The solution was not to fight the system openly, but to disappear into it. Under Miranda's influence, the Genovese family minimized unnecessary communication. Orders were delivered indirectly. Meetings were limited. Paper trails were avoided at all costs. Members were discouraged from discussing business, even among themselves, unless absolutely necessary. Silence was not just encouraged, it was enforced. Unlike other families that relied on fear to maintain discipline, the Genovese family emphasized restraint. Members who attracted attention through violence, public disputes, or reckless behavior were quietly sidelined or removed. Those who demonstrated patience and discretion were promoted. This created a culture where survival depended on self-control. Miranda also supported the decentralization of operations. Rather than concentrating power in visible leadership figures, responsibilities were distributed across layers of trusted individuals. This made it difficult for law enforcement to identify a single point of failure. If one group was compromised, others continued operating unaffected. The family's leadership structure was intentionally opaque. Titles existed, but authority flowed informally. Decisions were made through consensus rather than command, allowing leadership to deny direct involvement if necessary. This approach frustrated investigators. Wiretaps yielded little information. Informants struggled to explain the organization's structure. Prosecutions failed to connect leadership to criminal acts conclusively that Miranda's influence extended to how conflicts were handled. Disputes were resolved internally, quietly, and without spectacle. Violence was used sparingly and strategically, never impulsively. Every action was measured against one question. Will this bring attention? If the answer was yes, the action was reconsidered. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to the behavior of other crime families during the same period. While rival organizations were decimated by high-profile prosecutions, internal betrayals, and public scandals, the Genovese family remained remarkably intact. They were rarely mentioned in headlines, rarely associated with sensational trials, rarely exposed through dramatic testimony. This was not luck that IT was designed. Miranda also understood the importance of generational continuity. Younger members were trained not just in criminal activity, but in conduct. They were taught that patience was more valuable than aggression, and that discretion was the highest form of loyalty. This education created long-term stability. Even when federal laws, such as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act were introduced, the Genovese family adapted more smoothly than others. Their existing culture of silence and compartmentalization aligned naturally with a new legal landscape. Where others scrambled to adjust, the Genovese family simply continued that Miranda's role in shaping this culture was rarely acknowledged publicly, but it was widely understood internally. He became a quiet reference point, a model of how power could be maintained without being displayed. His influence extended beyond his lifetime. Long after he withdrew from active leadership, the principles he promoted remained embedded in the organization. Subsequent leaders adopted similar strategies. Silence continued to define the family's identity. Historians and investigators would later describe the Genovese family as the most secretive and resilient of the five families. They operated with fewer defections, fewer internal wars, and fewer catastrophic prosecutions. This reputation was not accidental, but IT was the result of decades of disciplined restraint, shaped in large part by Michele Miranda's philosophy. In a criminal world often defined by chaos, Miranda offered order. In an environment driven by ego, he prioritized structure. In an era obsessed with reputation, he chose obscurity. And in doing so, he helped create an organization that survived when others collapsed. In the next segment, we will explore how Miranda's influence extended beyond the Genovese family itself, shaping alliances, inter-family relations, and the balance of power across the American Mafia as a whole. Chapter 6, Segment 2, The Quiet Broker, How Miranda Shaped Mafia Alliances Without Ever Leading them. As the Genovese family refined its internal culture of silence and restraint, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda's influence expanded outward, beyond his own family and into the wider ecosystem of the American Mafia. This expansion did not occur through declarations or formal authority. It unfolded quietly through trust, memory, and the ability to steady conflicts before they became wars. Miranda understood something many others did not. The American Mafia was not a collection of isolated families competing endlessly for dominance. It was a system, and systems collapsed when instability spread unchecked. While some leaders thrived on confrontation, Miranda acted as a stabilizer. He became a quiet broker between families, a man whose counsel was sought not because he demanded it, but because it prevented chaos. When disputes emerged over territory, business arrangements, or personal slights, Miranda often served as an informal intermediary. He did not impose solutions. He framed them. His strength lay in credibility. Miranda had lived through the formative years of the American Mafia. He had witnessed the Castellammarese War, the rise of the Commission, the fall of legendary bosses, and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. This institutional memory made his advice valuable. When leaders disagreed, Miranda reminded them of precedent. He referenced past outcomes, not as threats, but as lessons. His interventions were calm, measured, and practical. This approach earned respect. Other families recognized that Miranda was not seeking advantage. He was seeking balance. In an underworld where nearly every negotiation carried hidden motives, this neutrality was rare. IT made him trusted that Miranda's relationships extended to key figures across the 5 families. He maintained open lines of communication without formal alliances. These connections allowed him to gauge tensions early, long before they reached crisis levels, that he believed that prevention was always preferable to resolution. Rather than waiting for conflicts to explode, Miranda encouraged quiet compromises. Adjustments were made discreetly. Business arrangements were modified without public acknowledgement. Ego was managed through subtle concessions rather than humiliation. This method reduced violence, but IT also reduced attention. Law enforcement agencies often monitored inter-family conflicts closely, knowing that violence and power struggles generated informants, wiretaps, and public exposure. By minimizing these conflicts, Miranda indirectly protected all involved. His influence also extended to how families interacted with non-mafia criminal organizations. Labor unions, construction firms, gambling operations, and political contacts required coordination across family lines. Miranda encouraged cooperation rather than competition in these spaces. Shared interests were safer than contested ones. This philosophy helped prevent the fragmentation that plagued other criminal networks. Rather than splintering into rival factions, the American Mafia, particularly in New York, maintained a relatively stable balance of power through much of the mid-20th century. Miranda did not invent this balance, but he preserved it. He was particularly cautious about generational transitions. As older leaders aged or were removed, younger figures often sought to prove themselves through aggression. Miranda countered this impulse by emphasizing continuity. He reminded rising figures that survival depended on patience, not spectacle. When necessary, he used quiet pressure. Warnings were delivered privately. Expectations were made clear without threats. Those who ignored this guidance often found themselves isolated rather than confronted. Isolation, Miranda believed, was more effective than violence, by withholding access rather than applying force. The system corrected itself. Miranda's role as a broker also reinforced the Genovese family's reputation as the most disciplined and least volatile organization within Mafia. Other families observed this stability and, in many cases, mirrored aspects of the approach. Silence spread. Discretion became valued. Visibility declined. This did not eliminate crime, but it changed its character. Organized crime became less theatrical and more bureaucratic. Power shifted from individuals to structures. Miranda was comfortable in this environment. He did not need recognition to exert influence. His authority came from consistency. When he spoke, others listened, not because he demanded obedience, but because ignoring him often led to problems. Over time, his presence became synonymous with predictability. And in a criminal world defined by uncertainty, predictability was invaluable. Even as federal pressure intensified and public perception of organized crime shifted, the alliances Miranda helped maintain endured. They adapted quietly, without dramatic ruptures. This resilience was no accident. That IT was the result of years of subtle intervention, careful communication, and a refusal to let ego override stability. In the next segment, we will examine how this broader influence positioned Miranda uniquely during periods of crisis, when law enforcement pressure peaked, informants emerged, and the survival of the Mafia itself was tested. Chapter 6, Segment 3, Crisis Without Collapse. How Miranda's system endured informants, trials, and federal pressure. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the American Mafia faced a threat unlike anything it had encountered before. This was not a rival gang or a territorial war. It was exposure, congressional hearings, federal task forces, and a growing willingness among insiders to speak began to pull back the curtain on an organization that had survived largely through secrecy. For many Mafia families, this era was devastating. High-profile informants emerged. Long prison sentences followed. Entire leadership structures were dismantled through courtroom testimony and recorded conversations. The old rules, silence, loyalty, tradition, began to fracture under the weight of fear and self-preservation. Yet through this period of unprecedented pressure, the Genovese crime family did not collapse. Michele Big Mike, Miranda's influence was a critical reason why. Long before informants became a defining feature of organized crime prosecutions, Miranda had anticipated the danger. He understood that betrayal was not a matter of morality, but of probability. The more exposed a system became, the more likely individuals would choose survival over loyalty, rather than relying on faith and silence. Miranda built structures that limited damage when silence failed. Information was compartmentalized. Members knew only what they needed to know. Operations were separated in ways that prevented any single arrest from unraveling an entire network. Leadership decisions were rarely communicated explicitly, making it difficult for informants to connect crimes directly to those at the top. This foresight proved invaluable. When figures like Joe Valachi broke omerta and testified publicly about the Mafia's existence, law enforcement gained validation, but not necessarily clarity. Valachi confirmed the organization, but he struggled to explain how the Genovese family actually functioned. That confusion was by design. Miranda's system ensured that even insiders lacked a complete picture. Loyalty was no longer the sole defense against informants. Structural ignorance became the real protection. During major prosecutions, this ambiguity frustrated investigators. Testimony often lacked corroboration. Connections were suggested, but not proven. Charges collapsed due to insufficient evidence linking leadership to criminal acts. Miranda watched these developments carefully, but he did not panic. He did not react publicly. He adjusted quietly as federal pressure increased. Miranda encouraged even greater restraint. Meetings were reduced further. Communication became indirect. Decisions were delayed rather than rushed. Risk was evaluated conservatively. The goal was not expansion. It was survival. This restraint contrasted sharply with other families that responded to pressure through aggression or internal purges. Such reactions often created instability, resentment, and ultimately more informants. Miranda avoided this trap. He understood that fear-driven loyalty was temporary. Stability-driven loyalty lasted longer. Rather than punishing suspected weakness harshly, the Genovese family under Miranda's influence often isolated risk quietly. Individuals who attracted attention were removed from sensitive roles. Access was limited. Responsibilities were reassigned. This minimized damage without provoking desperation. Even as new federal tools emerged, wiretaps, conspiracy statutes, enhanced surveillance, the Genovese family adapted incrementally. They did not resist change. They absorbed it. Miranda's approach also influenced how the family responded to trials and prison sentences. Incarceration was treated as a temporary condition, not a catastrophe. Legal defense was organized quietly. Families were supported discreetly. No public outrage. No dramatic gestures. This calm response reduced pressure on those facing prosecution. It also discouraged cooperation with authorities. If the system continued functioning, there was less incentive to betray Miranda's leadership philosophy, though rarely visible, created an environment where panic was unnecessary. The family did not depend on any single individual. It depended on continuity. Even as Miranda aged and withdrew further from daily involvement, the principles he embedded remained intact. Younger leaders absorbed the culture of restraint. Silence became instinctive rather than enforced. By the time sweeping federal prosecutions reshaped the mafia landscape in later decades, the Genovese family was still widely regarded as the most intact and disciplined of the five families. This was not coincidence. It was the outcome of decades spent prioritizing structure over spectacle, patience over aggression, and invisibility over reputation. Michele Miranda did not prevent the mafia from being challenged, but he ensured it did not collapse under pressure. His legacy was not built on headlines or fear. It was built on endurance. In the next chapter, we will move toward the later years of Miranda's life, examining how he stepped back from influence, how others interpreted his absence, and how his philosophy quietly outlived the man himself, continuing to shape organized crime long after his name faded from public memory. Chapter 7, Segment 1, The Quiet Withdrawal, How Big Mike Stepped Back Without Losing Control. By the early 1960s, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda was no longer a young man navigating the violent uncertainty of the early Mafia era. He had survived Prohibition, internecine wars, government crackdowns, and the transformation of organized crime from street-level brutality into a sophisticated, multi-layered enterprise. Many of the men he had come up with were dead, imprisoned, or exposed. Yet Miranda remained, aging, cautious, and increasingly distant from day-to-day operations. What made Miranda's later years remarkable was not his withdrawal from visibility. But how little changed when he did in most criminal organizations. Leadership transitions are moments of vulnerability. Power vacuums invite ambition. Rivalries surface. Violence becomes a tool for repositioning. The absence of a central figure often destabilizes the entire structure. That did not happen with Michele Miranda. Instead, his retreat from the foreground was almost imperceptible. Miranda did not announce retirement. He did not formally step aside. He simply reduced his presence, trusting that the system he had spent decades shaping could function without constant supervision. This was not neglect. It was confidence that by this point, Miranda had already embedded his philosophy deeply into the Genovese family's culture. Decisions were made conservatively. Ambition was moderated by long-term thinking. Visibility was treated as a liability rather than an achievement. Because of this, Miranda did not need to issue orders to remain influential. His influence was structural. As younger figures rose through the ranks, they did so within boundaries he had defined. Promotions were earned through reliability, not aggression. Reckless behavior was quietly discouraged. Those who sought attention found themselves sidelined rather than rewarded. This environment made succession less dramatic than in other families. While other mafia organizations experienced internal struggles as aging leaders lost control, the Genovese family transitioned through quiet consensus. Authority flowed through established channels. No single individual attempted to dominate openly. Because the system itself resisted such behavior, Miranda's absence from daily operations also reduced law enforcement pressure. Investigators searching for a boss found no clear target. Leadership appeared diffuse. Decision-making seemed opaque. This ambiguity frustrated efforts to identify a single figurehead responsible for criminal activity in effect. Miranda's withdrawal made the family even harder to penetrate from a distance. It might have appeared that Miranda was fading into irrelevance. In reality, his earlier decisions continued to guide behavior. Even without his direct involvement, members acted according to norms he had reinforced for years. This was leadership without presence. Importantly, Miranda avoided the common trap of clinging to power past his prime. Many aging crime bosses attempted to maintain control through fear or favoritism, often triggering resentment and betrayal. Miranda did neither. He trusted the culture he had built as federal scrutiny intensified throughout the 1960s. This trust proved justified. The Genovese family avoided the dramatic implosions that plagued other organizations. While arrests occurred and investigations continued, there was no singular collapse. That Miranda's quiet exit also insulated him personally. Without public displays of authority, there was little for prosecutors to attach directly to him. His name appeared in reports, but evidence remained thin. He was known, but rarely provable. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent avoiding unnecessary exposure. In his later years, Miranda became more of a symbolic figure than an operational one. His reputation carried weight, but his involvement was minimal. This reduced risk not only for him, but for the family as a whole. Younger leaders understood that drawing attention, even to demonstrate power, was counterproductive. Miranda's example taught them that true authority did not require spectacle. Why the time his health declined further. Miranda had already ensured that his departure would not be disrupted. The Genovese family continued operating with the same discipline, restraint, and patience that had defined it for decades. This quiet continuity was perhaps Miranda's greatest achievement. He did not need monuments or recognition. He did not seek loyalty through fear. He built a system capable of surviving him. In the next segment, we will explore how Miranda's death was received within the mafia world, how it passed with little public notice, yet marked the end of an era whose influence continued long after the man himself was gone. Chapter 7, Segment 2, Death Without Drama. The passing of a man who never sought the spotlight. When Michele "Big Mike" Miranda died in 1973, there were no headlines announcing the end of a criminal empire. No sensational newspaper photos. No sudden eruptions of violence. No dramatic reshuffling of power that outsiders could point to and say, "This is the moment everything changed." And that, more than anything else, captured who Miranda truly was, that in a world where mob deaths often triggered chaos, retaliation, or bloody succession battles, Miranda's passing was almost eerily quiet. Inside the Genovese crime family, his death was acknowledged with solemn respect. Outside of it, most Americans never noticed at all. This silence was not accidental. It was the final reflection of a lifetime spent operating beneath the surface to be why the time Miranda passed. His role had already shifted from decision-maker to stabilizing presence. His authority had long been institutional rather than personal. Younger leaders had internalized his methods so thoroughly that there was no sudden absence to compensate for. There was no scramble to replace him, because no one man had replaced him in years. Within the mafia world, Miranda's death was understood as the closing of a chapter, not the collapse of a structure. Senior figures recognized that the discipline, secrecy, and restraint he had championed would continue to define the Genovese family moving forward. In contrast, when louder bosses died, law enforcement often saw immediate signs of disruption. Internal conflicts, sloppy mistakes, informants emerging. None of that followed Miranda's death. The machinery he helped design simply kept running. From a law enforcement perspective, this was deeply frustrating. Investigators had long suspected Miranda's importance, but his low profile and minimal direct involvement made it difficult to build strong cases. Even in death, he left behind little evidence that could be retroactively used against him or others. There were no diaries, no dramatic confessions, no flamboyant associates eager to tell stories that Miranda's name remained in FBI files, but largely as a connective thread rather than a central figure. Analysts would later note that his influence was felt more in how the Genovese family operated than in any specific criminal act that could be traced directly to him. This was a legacy built on absence. Within mafia culture, respect is often measured by reaction. The absence of chaos following Miranda's death was, paradoxically, a testament to his power. It demonstrated that he had succeeded where many others failed, creating continuity beyond his own lifespan. Older mobsters spoke of him with quiet admiration. He was not remembered as a killer or a tyrant, but as a man who understood restraint, a man who knew when not to act, a man who recognized that survival depended on patience, not ego. Younger members, many of whom had never interacted with Miranda directly, still felt his influence. The rules they followed, the caution they practiced, and the preference for consensus over confrontation all traced back to his philosophy. Miranda did not leave behind myths or legends in the traditional sense. There are no dramatic stories meant to intimidate outsiders or inspire followers. Instead, his legacy lived in organizational behavior, in what was avoided rather than what was done to in death. He became almost invisible to the public record. But within the underworld, his absence was deeply felt precisely because it did not cause disruption. This quiet ending stood in stark contrast to the fates of more flamboyant mob figures, whose deaths often marked the beginning of decline. Miranda's passing marked continuity. IT confirmed that his greatest achievement was not personal power, but structural endurance. In the final segment of this chapter, we will examine how historians and crime scholars later reassessed Michele Miranda's role, how a man nearly forgotten by the public came to be recognized, as one of the most important architects of modern organized crime leadership. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Rewriting the Story, How History Finally Understood Michele Big Mike Miranda. For decades after his death, Michele Big Mike Miranda existed only in footnotes. His name appeared briefly in FBI memos, congressional hearings, and academic studies of organized crime, usually mentioned in passing, never centered, never dramatized. In a genre dominated by loud personalities and violent spectacle, Miranda's quiet authority made him easy to overlook. But over time, historians began to notice something strange. Whenever the Genovese crime family was discussed, its unusual stability, its resistance to internal collapse, its ability to survive law enforcement pressure, Miranda's name kept resurfacing, not as a culprit in headline crimes, but as a constant presence during the family's most stable decades. Slowly, reassessment began. Crime scholars reviewing long-term mafia power structures started asking a different kind of question. Instead of focusing on who ordered the most murders or made the most money, they began to ask, who built systems that lasted? Who shaped behavior rather than events? When viewed through that lens, Miranda's importance became impossible to ignore. Researchers comparing the Genovese family to other crime families noticed a pattern. Where others fractured under pressure, splintering into factions, bleeding informants, or collapsing after high-profile prosecutions, the Genovese organization remained disciplined, cautious, and unusually insulated. That insulation had roots. Miranda had been one of the earliest proponents of decentralized authority within the family. He understood that concentrating power created vulnerability. Instead of a single visible leader issuing commands, he favored layered decision-making, quiet consensus, and indirect control. This approach made the family harder to penetrate. Informants struggled to provide useful information because there were fewer dramatic orders, fewer explicit directives, fewer moments where one man could be blamed in many ways. Miranda anticipated modern organizational theory decades before it entered business schools. Historians also noted his role as a cultural translator. Miranda bridged generations, born into old-world Sicilian values but fully immersed in American urban life. He understood how to preserve tradition without allowing it to become rigid or self-destructive. While others clung to outdated codes or resisted change, Miranda adapted quietly. He allowed the Genovese family to modernize without losing its internal cohesion. This adaptability proved crucial during periods of intense law enforcement pressure in the mid-20th century. As the FBI expanded its surveillance capabilities and prosecutors refined racketeering laws, many mafia leaders failed to adjust. Miranda did that. He reduced exposure. He minimized meetings. He discouraged unnecessary violence. He prioritized patience over profit spikes that could attract attention. These choices did not make headlines, but they kept the organization alive. That be why the late 20th century, scholars studying organized crime began to describe Miranda as an institutional leader rather than traditional mob boss. His influence was structural, not personal. He shaped norms, expectations, and procedures rather than relying on fear or charisma. This reframing placed him in a category shared by only a handful of figures in mafia history, men whose impact outlasted their direct involvement. Ironically, Miranda's obscurity became part of his legacy. Unlike more infamous mobsters, he did not become a pop culture icon. He was not romanticized in movies or exaggerated in books. This absence of mythology allowed historians to analyze his role with greater objectivity. What emerged was a portrait of a man who understood power not as dominance, but as continuity. Even law enforcement perspectives evolved. Retired FBI agents and prosecutors later acknowledged that figures like Miranda were among the most difficult adversaries they faced. Not because they were violent, but because they were disciplined. One former investigator noted that the most dangerous criminals were not the ones who sought attention, but the ones who made themselves unnecessary. That observation could have been written about Miranda. Today, when historians map the architecture of the American Mafia, Michele, Big Mike, Miranda is increasingly recognized as a central pillar, quiet, unassuming, but foundational. His story challenges the popular image of organized crime as a world driven solely by brutality and ego. Instead, it reveals a subtler truth. The most powerful figures are often the least visible. The most enduring leaders are rarely the loudest. And the most dangerous men are sometimes the ones who never seem to be there at all. That in the next chapter, we will widen the lens, placing Miranda within the broader Genovese dynasty to understand how his philosophy shaped the family long after his death, influencing leaders who followed and ensuring that his silent blueprint continued to govern one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. Chapter 8, Segment 1, The Genovese Blueprint, How Miranda's Philosophy Outlived Him. When Michele, Big Mike, Miranda died, there was no dramatic power struggle, no s'adempere, no violent reshuffling of alliances. In the world of organized crime, where death often created chaos, his passing produced something unusual, continuity. That continuity was not accidental. It was the result of decades of deliberate design. That be why the time Miranda faded from the scene. The Genovese crime family was no longer dependent on any single personality. It operated through routines, expectations, and unwritten rules that functioned regardless of who sat at the top. Leadership transitioned quietly. Decisions continued to flow, and the machinery of the organization kept moving with minimal disruption. This was Miranda's final achievement. Unlike flasher mob bosses who ruled through fear or spectacle, Miranda believed the most dangerous organization was one that didn't need constant leadership intervention. He viewed the mafia not as a stage for individual dominance, but as a system, one that required balance, restraint, and long-term thinking. That system became known informally as the Genovese way. Under Miranda's influence, authority within the family was intentionally diffused. Power existed, but it was layered. Capos handled day-to-day matters with autonomy. Soldiers understood boundaries without being micromanaged. Sensitive decisions were filtered through multiple voices rather than dictated from above. This structure served two purposes. First, it limited exposure. If law enforcement removed one figure, the system adapted rather than collapsed. There were fewer single points of failure. No charismatic tyrant whose downfall could unravel everything. Second, it discouraged internal ambition from turning violent. Miranda understood that unchecked ego was one of the mafia's greatest weaknesses. By reducing opportunities for dramatic power grabs, he minimized the internal conflicts that had destroyed other families. This philosophy directly influenced the leaders who followed him. When subsequent Genovese bosses took control, they inherited an organization conditioned to value discretion over dominance. Meetings were rare. Orders were indirect. Violence was calculated and increasingly avoided unless absolutely necessary, in contrast to other crime families that fell apart under surveillance and informants. The Genovese family remained notoriously opaque. Investigators struggled to identify clear chains of command. Wiretaps produced fragments rather than confessions. Informants often lacked actionable intelligence because decisions were made collectively and quietly. Law enforcement frustration grew. Many agents came to view the Genovese family as the most difficult organized crime group to dismantle. Not because it was the largest or most violent, but because it was the most disciplined. That discipline traced back to Miranda. He had taught the family that survival required patience. that profit spikes were less important than longevity. That public attention was a liability, not a trophy. Perhaps most importantly, Miranda embedded a culture of self-restraint. Members were expected to control impulses, avoid unnecessary confrontations, and prioritize the organization's stability over personal grievances. This ran counter to the popular image of the mafia as impulsive and explosive. But in practice, it proved devastatingly effective. Even when federal prosecutions intensified under new laws and investigative techniques, the Genovese family adapted. They reduced direct involvement in crimes that carried high legal risk. They shifted toward influence rather than ownership. They allowed intermediaries to absorb exposure. These adjustments were not reactions, they were evolutions. Miranda had prepared the organization to think generationally. Decisions were measured not in weeks or months, but in decades. Leaders were judged by how little disruption they caused, not how much territory they seized. This mindset shaped internal succession as well. Rather than dramatic coronations, leadership transitions occurred gradually. Senior figures eased into advisory roles. Younger members absorbed responsibilities quietly. Titles mattered less than trust and experience as a result. The Genovese family avoided the internal wars that devastated rival organizations. Historians now recognize this period as a turning point in American organized crime. While other families declined, fragmented, or imploded under pressure, the Genovese family endured. Less visible, less flamboyant, but remarkably intact. Miranda did not live to see the full extent of his legacy, but his influence lingered in every cautious decision, every avoided confrontation, every meeting that never happened. In many ways, the Genovese family became a reflection of its quiet architect, invisible when possible, silent when necessary, present without being seen. In the next segment, we will examine how this blueprint affected the broader mafia landscape, how Miranda's approach reshaped relationships between families, altered the balance of power nationwide, and quietly redefined what it meant to rule the underworld in America's modern era. Chapter 8, Segment 2, The Quiet Standard, How Other Mafia Families Learned from Miranda's Silence. As the years passed, after Michele, Big Mike, Miranda stepped away from daily influence, something subtle began to happen across the American Mafia landscape. Other crime families, some weakened, some desperate, started to change the way they operated. Not openly, not formally, but quietly, in ways that mirrored the Genovese family's approach. This shift did not happen because Miranda demanded that IT happen because his methods worked. During the mid to late 20th century, law enforcement pressure on organized crime intensified dramatically. New surveillance tools, aggressive federal prosecutors, and sweeping legislation like the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act transformed the risks of traditional mafia leadership. Bosses who had once ruled through intimidation and visibility suddenly found themselves exposed. Many did not adapt in time. Highly publicized figures fell one by one. Some were imprisoned for life. Others were murdered. A few cooperated with authorities, accelerating the collapse of entire organizations. In contrast, the Genovese family remained largely intact, operating quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention, and maintaining internal stability. Other families noticed in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New Jersey, leadership began studying the Genovese structure. They observed how minimal communication reduced legal exposure, how layered authority protected senior figures, how silence itself could be a weapon. The idea of a front-facing boss, once a symbol of power, began to feel obsolete. Instead, a new ideal emerged: leadership without spectacle. This concept had its roots in Miranda's philosophy. He believed that a boss should be felt, not seen. Decisions should ripple outward without revealing their source. Authority should be unquestioned, but rarely announced. Under this model, the strongest leaders were those whose names never appeared in headlines. Some families attempted to copy this structure directly. Others adapted pieces of it. They reduced large gatherings, limited written communication, relied on intermediaries to pass messages, delegated more responsibility downward while shielding those at the top. Results varied. Organizations with deep internal discipline managed to survive longer. Those plagued by ego and rivalry struggled to maintain consistency. Miranda's system required patience, trust, and a willingness to remain invisible, qualities not every leader possessed. Still, the influence was undeniable. Even federal investigators acknowledged the shift. Intelligence reports began describing a new mafia, one less violent, less centralized, and far harder to penetrate. Informants became less useful when knowledge was compartmentalized. Wiretaps captured fragments without context. Surveillance revealed routine behavior, but not decision-making. This transformation frustrated law enforcement, but it was not accidental that IT was learned behavior. Miranda had demonstrated that longevity depended on predictability, that organizations collapsed not from external pressure alone, but from internal chaos magnified by exposure. By reducing both, he extended the life of the Genovese family well beyond its peers. His influence also altered inter-family relationships. Rather than engaging in frequent disputes over territory or respect, families increasingly relied on negotiation and mutual understanding. Conflicts were settled quietly. Violence, while still present, became less impulsive and more strategic. This restraint did not signal weakness, that IT signaled survival. Miranda understood that every act of violence created ripples. Witnesses, investigations, attention. He preferred influence to intimidation, compromise to confrontation. This approach reduced friction not only within his own family, but across the broader mafia network. Over time, the commission itself, the governing body of the American Mafia, reflected this evolution. Meetings became rare and tightly controlled. Decisions were deferred rather than rushed. Authority flowed through consensus rather than decree. While Miranda was not the sole architect of these changes, his role was foundational. He had proven that leadership did not require charisma or brutality. It required discipline, foresight, and the ability to remain unseen. Ironically, this made him harder to mythologize. Hollywood favored loud figures. Historians focused on dramatic rises and violent falls. Miranda's story lacked spectacle, even though his influence was profound. Yet within the underworld, his reputation endured that he became a reference point, a benchmark, the quiet standard against which effective leadership was measured. Younger leaders were encouraged to emulate his restraint. Older ones cited his success as proof that silence could be more powerful than fear. I end this way. Miranda shaped not just one family, but an entire era of organized crime. He did not dominate headlines. He did not inspire cinematic portrayals. He did not seek recognition. Instead, he left behind a system that taught others how to survive when attention itself became the greatest threat. In the next segment, we will explore how this quiet revolution affected law enforcement strategy, how investigators adapted to a mafia that no longer behaved like the one they thought they understood, and how Miranda's legacy forced a fundamental rethinking of how organized crime was pursued in America. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Chasing a Ghost. How law enforcement struggled against Miranda's model. By the time law enforcement fully realized how deeply Michele "Big Mike" Miranda's philosophy had reshaped the mafia, the old rules of investigation no longer applied. The enemy they thought they understood had changed form. What remained was not a visible hierarchy of loud bosses and violent enforcers, but something far more difficult to confront: a quiet, disciplined network designed to leave almost no trace. For decades, federal investigators had built cases against organized crime using predictable patterns. Bosses held meetings. Orders flowed downward. Violence created witnesses. Money left trails. Informants filled in the gaps. This model had worked, slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. That Miranda's approach dismantled it piece by piece. Under the Genovese structure he helped solidify, communication became indirect and fragmented. No single individual held complete knowledge of operations. Orders were passed verbally, often through layers of intermediaries who themselves understood only fragments of a larger picture. Written records were avoided. Meetings were rare, brief, and carefully controlled. TO investigators, it felt like chasing smoke. Wiretaps, once a cornerstone of mafia prosecutions, yielded increasingly little value. Conversations were mundane. Names were avoided. Language was coded, but not in obvious ways. Often, recordings captured nothing more than casual discussions of family, weather, or routine business. Conversations indistinguishable from those of ordinary citizens. Surveillance faced similar obstacles. Senior figures maintained unremarkable routines. They avoided flashy displays of wealth. They did not frequent known criminal gathering places. Many appeared, on paper, to be retired or semi-legitimate businessmen. Without visible activity, law enforcement struggled to justify deeper scrutiny. Even informants became less useful in earlier eras. A single cooperating witness could unravel an entire organization. Under Miranda's model, informants often possessed limited, compartmentalized knowledge. They could describe their own roles, but not the broader structure. Their testimony, while still valuable, rarely reached high enough to implicate senior leadership. This frustration was evident in internal FBI and Department of Justice communications. Investigators began describing the Genovese family as insulated, opaque, and remarkably disciplined. Some acknowledged, privately, that traditional methods were failing. The organization had not disappeared. It had adapted beyond the reach of familiar tools. The irony was not lost on law enforcement. Years earlier, corruption within federal agencies had allowed figures like Miranda to operate with minimal interference. Now, even as agencies became more aggressive and better funded, they found themselves outpaced by a criminal structure that had learned from past exposure, in response. Investigators were forced to evolve it. Long-term investigations replaced rapid takedowns. Prosecutors began building cases over decades rather than years. Financial crimes, tax evasion, fraud, labor racketeering became primary targets when violent offenses could not be directly tied to leadership. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, was designed precisely for this kind of challenge. It allowed prosecutors to pursue entire criminal enterprises rather than isolated crimes. Yet even RICO cases required patterns, witnesses, and connections, elements that Miranda's system deliberately minimized as a result. Some cases collapsed under their own weight. Trials stretched on for months, sometimes years. Juries struggled to follow complex chains of indirect evidence. Defense attorneys exploited the lack of direct proof, emphasizing the absence of recorded orders or documented meetings. Meanwhile, public perception shifted. The mafia, once synonymous with visible violence and headline-grabbing trials, faded into the background. Many assumed organized crime had been largely defeated. In reality, it had simply become quieter, more cautious, and more selective. This illusion of decline was itself a victory. Miranda understood that survival depended not on expansion, but on endurance. The less visible the organization became, the less urgency there was to dismantle it. Resources shifted to other priorities: terrorism, drug trafficking, cybercrime, while traditional organized crime investigations received diminishing attention. For the Genovese family, this environment was ideal. They continued operating within familiar spheres: construction, labor unions, waste management, gambling, while avoiding the excesses that had doomed other families. Their influence remained significant, even as their public profile all but vanished. Law enforcement adapted, but never fully caught up. Some successes came through patient financial analysis, others through rare high-level cooperators. But the sweeping collapses seen in previous decades became increasingly rare. Instead, investigations chipped away slowly, often removing mid-level figures while senior leadership remained untouched. This was not a failure of effort. That IT was the result of a system designed to withstand scrutiny. That Miranda's legacy, in this sense, was not merely criminal. It was strategic. He had forced law enforcement to confront a new reality. That organized crime could survive without spectacle, without noise, and without obvious hierarchy. For investigators trained to hunt visible power, this was a profound challenge. And for historians, it created a paradox. The man who helped shape this transformation left behind few dramatic moments, few recorded statements, and little public acknowledgement. Yet his influence persisted long after his direct involvement ended, embedded in the very structure of modern organized crime. In the final chapters of this documentary, we will examine how Miranda's life came to an end, how his legacy was interpreted after his death, and why his quiet dominance remains one of the most instructive and unsettling lessons in mafia history. Because sometimes the most powerful figures are not the ones who fall in spectacular fashion, but the ones who quietly outlast everyone else. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The End Without Drama. Michele Miranda's Final Years. By the late 1970s, Michele "Big Mike" Miranda had achieved something almost unheard of in mafia history. He was still alive, still respected, still influential, and yet almost entirely invisible. While many of his contemporaries were dead, imprisoned, or publicly disgraced, Miranda entered the final phase of his life without sirens, indictments, or vendettas trailing behind him. There were no dramatic power struggles, no baile entre nubes, no betrayal from within his own ranks. His exit from the active center of the underworld was gradual, deliberate, and consistent with everything he had practiced for decades. Miranda did not retire in the conventional sense. Mafia bosses heredado. Instead, he slowly reduced his public footprint while maintaining quiet authority. He no longer appeared at gatherings where attention might be drawn. He avoided disputes. He delegated carefully. His opinions still carried weight, but he offered them sparingly, often through intermediaries. This withdrawal was not weakness. It was strategy.By stepping back. Miranda removed himself from the few remaining points of exposure. Younger leaders handled day-to-day operations. Captains managed crews. Decisions filtered upward only when absolutely necessary. The structure he helped build functioned smoothly without constant supervision, which is exactly how he intended it. Law enforcement, meanwhile, struggled to place him. There were no major arrests tied to his name. No high-profile trials. No cooperating witnesses pointing directly at him. Surveillance reports described an aging man with limited activity, reinforcing the impression that he was no longer relevant. In truth, Miranda's influence remained embedded in the system itself. The Genovese family continued operating under the principles he had championed: silence, discipline, and insulation. Other families, too, increasingly adopted similar methods, learning from decades of costly mistakes. In this way, Miranda's philosophy extended beyond his own organization, shaping the broader mafia landscape in ways few outsiders recognized. His personal life during these years was deliberately unremarkable. He lived quietly. He avoided excess. He did not flaunt wealth or status. Neighbors knew him, if at all, as an elderly man with a routine existence. This ordinariness was not accidental. It was the final layer of protection. For Miranda, survival had always depended on appearing unimportant. As's health declined. There were no internal moves against him. No whispers of replacement or resentment. This alone set him apart from many mafia leaders whose final years were marked by paranoia and isolation. Miranda had cultivated loyalty not through fear, but through consistency and fairness. Those who worked with him understood the value of his approach. He did not gamble recklessly with their lives. He did not provoke unnecessary conflicts. He did not draw attention for personal glory. In a world built on betrayal, this restraint inspired a rare form of trust. When Michele Miranda died in 1981, his passing barely registered beyond a small circle of insiders. There were no headlines announcing the death of a mafia titan. No sensational media coverage. No public reckoning. His name did not dominate newspapers or documentaries. For many Americans, his death went entirely unnoticed. Yet within organized crime, it was quietly acknowledged as the end of an era. Miranda represented a generation that valued survival over spectacle. A leadership style rooted in patience rather than aggression. His death marked the gradual fading of the old guard, not through violence, but through time. The absence of chaos following his death was perhaps his greatest achievement. The Genovese family did not fracture. There was no immediate power vacuum. Operations continued seamlessly. This continuity reflected decades of careful planning and cultural discipline. Miranda had ensured that no single individual was indispensable, including himself. This was leadership designed to endure beyond any one person. For historians, this presents a challenge. How do you measure the impact of someone who left so little visible evidence behind? Who avoided trials, headlines, and dramatic finales? Whose influence was structural rather than theatrical? The answer lies not in what Miranda did publicly, but in what he prevented. He prevented unnecessary violence. He prevented internal collapse. He prevented exposure. He prevented law enforcement from finding the kind of leverage that had destroyed other families. His success was not defined by conquest, but by continuity. In the next segment, we will examine how Miranda's legacy was interpreted after his death by law enforcement, by historians, and by those still operating within the shadows he helped shape. Because while he may have died quietly, the system he built continued to speak on his behalf. Chapter 9, Segment 2, How History Misread a Quiet Power. In the years following Michele "Big Mike" Miranda's death, the story of the American Mafia was retold again and again, often without him. Books, films, and documentaries gravitated toward louder figures. Men who raged, boasted, betrayed, or fell spectacularly. Violence made for compelling narratives. Silence did not. As a result, Miranda's role was frequently minimized or overlooked entirely. This was not an accident of history. It was a consequence of how power is usually measured. Historians and journalists tend to focus on moments of rupture: wars, trials, assassinations, and scandals. Miranda produced none of these. His influence did not peak in a single event. It accumulated slowly, expressed through stability rather than upheaval. For storytellers seeking drama, this made him difficult to place at the center of the narrative. Law enforcement records, however, told a different story. When analysts revisited decades of surveillance reports, wiretaps, and informant statements, a consistent pattern emerged. Miranda's name appeared repeatedly in moments of resolution rather than conflict, when disputes ended quietly, when alliances held, when chaos failed to materialize. He was present in the margins of many major developments, not as a provocateur, but as a stabilizer. This subtlety led some early researchers to misinterpret his significance. Without a trail of violence or public exposure, Miranda was sometimes categorized as secondary, an administrator rather than a leader. But this view overlooked the very thing that made him powerful. He did not need to dominate conversations to shape outcomes. Those who understood the internal culture of the Mafia recognized that restraint was often more dangerous than aggression. A man who could influence decisions without issuing threats possessed a deeper form of authority. Miranda's reputation was built on predictability. When he spoke, people listened, not because they feared an outburst, but because they trusted his judgment. Former investigators later acknowledged this blind spot. The focus on flamboyant bosses had obscured the machinery that kept organizations like the Genovese family intact. Miranda was part of that machinery. He was not the face of the operation. He was the spine. Even within organized crime folklore, his legacy was strangely muted. Stories passed down among associates rarely featured dramatic anecdotes about Miranda. Instead, they emphasized his reliability, his patience, his refusal to escalate situations unnecessarily. These traits did not translate easily into legend, but they translated extremely well into longevity. In a culture where myth often eclipses reality, Miranda's real achievement was mistaken for absence. Academic reassessments in later decades began to correct this imbalance. Scholars studying organizational crime started paying closer attention to structure rather than spectacle. They examined how certain families avoided the catastrophic collapses seen elsewhere. Again and again, the Genovese model stood out. That the center of that model was a philosophy Miranda embodied. Power should be diffuse, not concentrated. Visibility should be minimized. Leadership should be continuous, not charismatic. Above all, survival should outweigh ambition. This framework contrasted sharply with the public image of the Mafia popularized by movies and media. It also explained why families that adopted these principles endured longer and attracted less sustained law enforcement pressure. Miranda's name slowly returned to the conversation, not as a footnote, but as a case study. Law enforcement training materials began referencing figures like him as examples of low visibility leadership. Analysts warned that the absence of noise did not equal the absence of control. In fact, it often meant the opposite. The irony was impossible to ignore. Miranda had spent his life avoiding attention, and even in death, attention struggled to find him. Yet the deeper researchers looked, the clearer his influence became. He was not a shadow because he lacked substance. He was a shadow because he understood how light worked. For the families who continued operating after his death, this understanding remained invaluable. That Miranda's approach became institutional memory. New leaders inherited systems designed to protect them from their own impulses. The rules he helped enforce limited ego, discouraged recklessness, and punished exposure. These rules did not guarantee safety, but they dramatically improved the odds that in this way, Miranda's legacy was not personal. It was cultural. He changed how power was exercised, not by rewriting rules, but by enforcing them consistently. He proved that authority did not require spectacle, that silence could be strategic, that survival itself could be the ultimate expression of dominance. In the next segment, we will look at how this quiet philosophy shaped the Genovese family long after Miranda's death, and why, even today, his influence can still be traced through the structure of American organized crime. long after his name faded from public memory. Chapter 9, Segment 3, The Legacy That Never Needed a Name. Long after Michele "Big Mike" Miranda was gone, the world he helped shape continued to function almost exactly as he intended. There were no statues, no dramatic funerals remembered by the press, no myths built around his death. And yet, inside the structure of the Genovese crime family, his influence remained quietly intact. This was not coincidence. The systems Miranda reinforced were designed to outlive individuals. He believed that power tied too closely to a single personality was fragile. When a boss became larger than the organization eventually collapsed under the weight of ego, ambition, or exposure. Miranda worked deliberately to prevent that outcome. After his death, Genovese leadership did not fracture. There was no public struggle. No visible succession crisis. The family adjusted, absorbed the loss, and continued operating with minimal disruption. To outside observers, it looked almost uneventful. To those who understood organized crime, it was extraordinary. Most crime families experience turmoil when a stabilizing figure disappeared. The Genovese family did not. That continuity was Miranda's final achievement. He had spent decades reinforcing procedures that discouraged impulsive leadership. Decisions were filtered through councils rather than personalities. Disputes were resolved quietly. Violence remained a tool of last resort, not a reflex. Visibility was controlled. Language was coded. Exposure was punished. These principles did not die with him. They had become institutional. Even as law enforcement pressure intensified nationwide, the Genovese family remained notably resilient. While other organizations fell apart due to informants, internal wars, or high-profile prosecutions, the Genovese structure bent but rarely broke. Investigators often remarked that the family seemed to anticipate threats before they fully emerged. That anticipation was not accidental. Miranda had helped normalize the idea that paranoia, when disciplined, could be protected. He encouraged leaders to assume surveillance rather than deny it, to act as if every conversation might be overheard, to behave cautiously even in moments of apparent safety. This mindset reduced mistakes, not completely, but enough to matter. Former prosecutors later acknowledged that Genovese cases were uniquely difficult to build. Witnesses were scarce. Conversations were indirect. Chains of command were intentionally blurred. Even when arrests occurred, they often failed to dismantle the core leadership. The family absorbed losses and continued operating, smaller perhaps, but intact. This endurance reflected Miranda's philosophy more than any individual leader's charisma. He had understood something fundamental about criminal power in modern America. The era of flamboyant mob bosses was ending. Surveillance, informants, and federal statutes had changed the landscape. Survival required adaptation, not bravado. Miranda adapted early, in doing so, he helped transition the mafia from its violent, visible past into a quieter, more bureaucratic form of criminal organization. This evolution was less dramatic, but far more sustainable. It also made the Genovese family a model, one quietly studied by other groups, even as they publicly denied its influence. In interviews conducted decades later, former associates described Miranda with an unusual tone. Not admiration, not fear, but respect. They spoke of him as someone who understood the long game, someone who never rushed decisions, someone who listened more than he spoke, someone whose approval carried weight precisely because it was not easily given. These recollections lacked sensational detail. There are no stories of explosive violence or public displays of authority. Instead, they emphasize consistency, predictability, judgment. Miranda was remembered not for what he did, but for what he prevented. he prevented unnecessary wars, prevented reckless exposure, prevented internal collapse, prevented the kind of chaos that draws attention and invites destruction. In a world where criminal organizations often implode from within, this prevention was a form of mastery. As years passed, his name continued to fade from popular culture. Movies and books favored louder figures. The mythology of organized crime remained obsessed with excess, betrayal, ambition, bloodshed. Miranda fit none of these narratives comfortably. And yet, among those who studied the Mafia as a system rather than a spectacle, his importance only grew clearer. He represented a different archetype of criminal leadership, one rooted not in dominance, but in discipline, not in fear, but in trust, not in legacy building, but in continuity. This made him difficult to romanticize, but impossible to ignore. In many ways, Miranda's obscurity was his final victory. He had succeeded in shaping an empire that did not need him to be remembered in order to function. His influence lived on through habits, rules, and expectations rather than stories. The Genovese family did not collapse in a legend after his death. It persisted into reality. And that, perhaps, is the truest measure of Michele, Big Mike, Miranda's power. In the final chapter, we will step back and examine what his life ultimately reveals about leadership, silence, and survival, and why the most powerful figures in history are often the ones history struggles hardest to see. Chapter 10, Segment 1, Power Without a Voice. Michele, Big Mike, Miranda never sought to be remembered. That fact alone separates him from nearly every other figure in the history of American organized crime. In a world driven by ego, status, and reputation, Miranda built power by doing the opposite. He avoided attention. He minimized conflict. He let others speak while he listened. And through that silence, he shaped one of the most durable criminal organizations the United States has ever seen. Understand Miranda's significance. It helps to step back from the crimes themselves and look at the structure he helped preserve. The Genovese crime family did not survive because it was the most violent or the most profitable. It survived because it was the most disciplined. And discipline, more than brutality, was Miranda's defining contribution. Throughout his life, Miranda operated under a guiding principle that rarely appeared in headlines, but governed nearly every decision he made. Exposure is death. He understood that law enforcement did not need to eliminate every criminal to destroy an organization. It only needed enough noise, enough mistakes, enough internal chaos to unravel trust. Once trust collapsed, the rest followed naturally. Miranda worked relentlessly to prevent that unraveling. He discouraged emotional decision-making. He discouraged impulsive retaliation. He discouraged unnecessary displays of dominance. Instead, he emphasized patience, restraint, and procedure. Meetings were limited. Communication was indirect. Orders were filtered. Loyalty was tested quietly rather than demanded loudly. This approach did not eliminate violence from the Genovese family. Violence remained an integral part of organized crime, but it was controlled, measured, and purposeful. Acts of brutality were not statements of power. They were tools used sparingly and strategically. In this way, Miranda helped redefine what leadership looked like inside the Mafia. Earlier generations of mob bosses ruled through fear and spectacle. Their power depended on visibility. Their names were whispered because they wanted them to be. Miranda rejected that model entirely. He believed that the most dangerous man in the room should never appear dangerous at all. This belief shaped how others interacted with him. Associates did not fear Miranda in the conventional sense. They did not fear sudden rage or unpredictable violence. Instead, they feared disappointing him, losing his trust, being excluded from his confidence. That kind of authority is harder to challenge, because Miranda did not impose himself. No one could easily rebel against him. There was no tyranny to overthrow, no spotlight to seize. His power was embedded in the system itself, not attached to his personality. This made him unusually resilient. While other mafia leaders fell victim to informants, wiretaps, or internal betrayal, Miranda navigated decades of shifting alliances and increasing federal pressure without suffering catastrophic loss. He was questioned, he was investigated, but he was never fully exposed. The evidence never aligned cleanly enough. The witnesses never cooperated decisively enough. Part of this was luck, but much of it was design. Miranda understood how law enforcement thought. He understood how cases were built. He understood where pressure points existed and where they did not. He did not need to read FBI manuals to know that organizations collapse from within long before they are dismantled from outside. He focused inward. He fostered stability among captains. He mediated disputes before they escalated. He allowed profitable operations to continue uninterrupted as long as they remained discreet. He tolerated minor disagreements if they did not threaten unity. This tolerance prevented resentment from festering. In effect, Miranda acted less like a dictator and more like a caretaker. That role is rarely celebrated in criminal mythology. Caretakers do not inspire dramatic stories. They do not leave behind cinematic moments, but they keep systems alive. And in organized crime, survival is the ultimate measure of success as decades passed. Younger members of the Genovese family grew up inside a structure Miranda had helped normalize. They inherited habits rather than ideologies. Caution felt natural. Silence felt normal. Obedience to process felt safer than loyalty to individuals. Even when leadership changed, these habits persisted. This continuity made the Genovese family uniquely difficult to eradicate. Law enforcement agencies could disrupt operations, but they struggled to dismantle the core. There was no single figure whose removal would cause collapse. No charismatic leader whose fall would trigger chaos. Miranda had ensured that the family could survive without him. This is the paradox of his legacy. He was one of the most powerful men in American Mafia history, yet his influence is largely invisible. It exists not in stories, but in absences, in wars that never happened, in scandals that never broke, in names that never made headlines. Many historians. This invisibility is precisely why Miranda matters. He demonstrates that power does not always announce itself. That control does not require noise. That influence can be exercised through restraint rather than force. In a criminal world obsessed with dominance, Miranda mastered endurance. In the next segment, we will reflect on what Michele, Big Mike, Miranda ultimately teaches us about leadership itself, both within organized crime and beyond it, and why silence, when wielded correctly, can be more commanding than any threat ever spoken. Chapter 10, Segment 2. The Cost of Quiet Power. If Michele, Big Mike, Miranda represented stability, restraint, and continuity, then the true cost of his influence lies not only in what he prevented, but in what he allowed to continue. Quiet leadership, by its nature, leaves fewer visible fingerprints. And because of that, it also leaves fewer moments of reckoning. Miranda did not invent organized crime. He did not introduce corruption, exploitation, or violence into American society. Those forces existed long before he rose to power, and they would have continued without him. But by helping refine the machinery of the mafia into something more durable and disciplined, he prolonged its lifespan at a critical moment in American history. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of Miranda's legacy. During the mid-20th century, federal law enforcement slowly began to understand the scope of organized crime. Investigations expanded. Prosecutors grew bolder. Public awareness increased. For many criminal organizations, this pressure led to fragmentation, paranoia, and collapse. The Genovese family resisted that fate. Because of the structure, Miranda helped preserve, the family adapted. It shifted tactics. It reduced exposure. It learned how to coexist with surveillance rather than confront it directly. In doing so, it continued to extract wealth from unions, businesses, and communities long after other organizations began to falter. For those harmed by organized crime, this resilience was not admirable. It meant prolonged exploitation. It meant corruption embedded so deeply that removing it required years of legal reform, whistleblowers, and sustained political will. That Miranda's leadership, while effective, was not neutral, that he helped maintain systems that enriched a small circle at the expense of many. Construction projects were manipulated. Labor disputes were influenced behind closed doors. Legitimate businesses paid quietly to avoid disruption. Workers lost opportunities. Communities absorbed the cost. These effects were diffuse, spread across time and geography. There are no single moments that capture the full impact. Instead, the damage accumulated slowly, invisibly, much like Miranda's power itself. That invisibility made accountability difficult. Unlike more flamboyant mob figures, Miranda did not provide prosecutors with clear narratives. He did not leave behind confessions, dramatic arrests, or headline-grabbing trials. His name appears in records, testimony, and surveillance transcripts, but rarely as the central figure. He existed just outside the frame, influencing outcomes without claiming credit. This distance allowed him to age quietly while others fell dumpy. By the time organized crime faced its most aggressive legal assault through tools like the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, much of the groundwork Miranda had laid was already institutionalized. Even when leadership shifted, the culture he helped shape remained intact. This raises a deeper question that extends beyond organized crime. What does responsibility look like when power is exercised indirectly? In conventional morality, we tend to focus on visible actions. We judge people by what they do openly. But Miranda's influence challenges that framework. He rarely ordered violence directly. He rarely appeared at the center of decisions. Yet the systems he helped manage continued to produce harm. The caretaker less responsible than the executioner. The strategist less accountable than the soldier. These questions are uncomfortable because they force us to examine how large systems operate. Organized crime, like many institutions, does not rely on constant, overt cruelty to function. It relies on structure, routine, and compliance. Leaders like Miranda ensured that those mechanisms remained intact. In doing so, they made wrongdoing sustainable. Miranda's life also complicates the romanticized image of mafia leadership often portrayed in popular culture. There are no grand speeches, no dramatic betrayals, no cinematic downfall. His story lacks the emotional highs and lows that audiences expect. Instead, it offers something more unsettling. It shows how evil can persist quietly, how systems of exploitation do not always announce themselves with chaos, how harm can be administered politely, methodically, and with minimal disruption. This is perhaps the most important lesson Miranda leaves behind. That danger does not always look dangerous. That power does not always look powerful. That silence, when paired with authority, can be one of the most effective tools in any system, criminal or otherwise, that Miranda aged. His influence faded naturally rather than violently. There was no abrupt end, no decisive moment when the machinery he helped build collapsed. The Genovese family continued, changed, adapted. Law enforcement slowly chipped away, but never delivered a single definitive blow. This slow dissolution mirrors Miranda's own approach. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. This time, in the final segment of this documentary, we will step back once more and examine how history remembers figures like Michele, Big Mike, Miranda. Why some names endure while others fade, and why understanding the quiet architects of power may be more important than remembering the loud ones. Chapter 10, Segment 3. The man history nearly forgot. When Michele, Big Mike, Miranda died in 1973, there were no dramatic headlines announcing the end of an era. No televised perp walk. No courtroom spectacle. No final confession that forced the public to confront the full scope of his influence. His death passed quietly, much like his life in newspapers. If he was mentioned at all, it was briefly. An aging figure, a respected elder, a name known mostly to law enforcement and to men who understood the invisible hierarchies of organized crime. For the broader public, Miranda was already fading from memory before he was gone. And that may have been exactly how he wanted it. History often remembers criminals in extremes. The loudest, the most violent, the most theatrical. Names like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, John Gotti, and Carlo Gambino dominate books, documentaries, and films because they left behind clear narratives. Rise, reign, fall. Miranda left no such arc instead. His story exists in fragments. Surveillance reports. Testimony given decades later. Quiet acknowledgments from other mob figures who understood his role but rarely spoke it aloud. He was not the star of the story. He was the editor behind it. This absence has consequences. When history focuses only on visible villains, it risks misunderstanding how power truly operates. The Mafia did not survive because of charisma alone. It survived because of administrators, mediators, and stabilizers. Men who understood that violence was a tool, not a personality. Men who valued patience over spectacle. Miranda embodied that philosophy more completely than almost anyone else in American organized crime, that he served under multiple bosses. He lived through internal wars that eliminated others. He navigated the transition from old-world Sicilian traditions to a modern American criminal enterprise. He did all of this without ever becoming a liability. That kind of survival is not accidental. IT requires emotional control, strategic restraint, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Miranda knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to intervene and when to step back, when to enforce rules and when to allow flexibility. These are not traits typically celebrated in crime stories. They are not cinematic. They do not translate easily to myth, but they are real, and they are powerful. That as historians and law enforcement officials have revisited the structure of the Genovese family. Miranda's name increasingly appears as a connective figure. Not the originator of ideas, but the man who ensured continuity. The one who carried institutional memory forward when others fell, that he represented stability in a world defined by instability. This raises an important question for anyone studying organized crime, power structures, or leadership more broadly. Who truly shapes history? Is it the figure who draws attention, or the one who ensures the system endures? That Miranda's legacy suggests the latter. Even after his death, the principles he helped enforce continued to influence how the Genovese family operated. Silence over showmanship, discipline over ego, patience over impulse. These values allowed the organization to weather law enforcement pressure longer than most of the rivals. In that sense, Miranda outlived himself. Yet outside academic circles and specialized crime history, his name remains largely unknown. There are no major films centered on him. No scenes.As. No iconic scenes etched into popular culture. And that absence tells us something important. Power does not require recognition to be effective, in fact, recognition often weakens it. Miranda understood this instinctively. He avoided interviews. He avoided unnecessary conflict. He avoided attention. In doing so, he avoided many of the traps that destroyed others. His story challenges us to rethink how we define influence, not as dominance, not as fear, but as persistence, as the ability to shape outcomes quietly over time without needing credit. This documentary set out to uncover the story of a man rarely discussed, not because he was insignificant, but because he was too effective to be loud. Michele "Big Mike" Miranda was not a legend in the traditional sense. He was something more unsettling, but a reminder that the most powerful forces in history often operate just outside our field of vision. And that silence, when wielded deliberately, can shape the world as much as violence ever could. As we close this story, Miranda remains where he spent most of his life, in the background, uncelebrated, unseen, but undeniably present. And perhaps that is the truest measure of the man behind the Genovese dynasty. As the story of Michele "Big Mike" Miranda comes to an end, what lingers is not a trail of headlines or dramatic finales, but a quiet understanding of how power truly works when it is exercised without noise. Miranda did not seek to be remembered. He did not carve his name into history through spectacle or terror. Instead, he shaped outcomes from shadows, guiding one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America through decades of change, conflict, and survival. His life reminds us that history is not always written by the loudest voices. Sometimes it is written by those who never raise their voice at all. Behind every empire, legal or criminal, there are figures who never appear on the surface. Men who stabilize systems, men who ensure continuity, men who understand that endurance matters more than attention. Michele Miranda was one of those men. Tonight's story was not about glorifying crime, but about understanding structure, influence, and the unseen hands that move events forward. By studying figures like Miranda, we gain a clearer picture of how organizations endure and how silence can be as powerful as force. If you're listening as the day winds down, take a moment to reflect on the stories that go untold and the people history almost forgets. And before you drift off, let me know, where are you listening from tonight? If you find calm, long-form true crime stories like this helpful for rest, reflection, or understanding the hidden sides of history, consider subscribing. New stories arrive regularly, told quietly, patiently, and with care. For now, let the silence settle. Good night.